The carriage had no windows, and that told Amelia everything before her mother said a word. It had started with a letter, a summons to the castle, knights at the door, and a mother who looked at her the way you look at a chore you have finally found time to finish. They had draped a long black veil over her head, the kind a nun might wear, so heavy she could barely see the light green dress underneath. Then they had walked her out into the frozen courtyard to a black carriage marked with the king's own crest. Now her mother, Tanya, guided her up the step, drew the door shut, and turned the lock from the outside. The bolt slid home with a small, final sound, like the end of a sentence. Through the door, Tanya spoke. She did not raise her voice. She told Amelia to do her duty and make no sound, to obey the escorting knights without a single question, because a daughter of the Reeves family served the crown and asked for nothing. No goodbye came after it, only footsteps, walking away over the frost. Amelia sat in the dark and listened. Just outside, one of the escort knights murmured to another, not bothering to lower his voice much, since the girl inside was not supposed to matter. He said she was the substitute, the body that would go to the Dragon Peninsula and pay the princess's debt, so that no one who mattered would have to. So that was the shape of it. She did not pound on the door. She did not scream her mother's name. She had learned over 2 lifetimes that no one on the far side of a locked door was ever coming back for her. Far out past the harbor, where the water should have been empty, something moved. A shadow the size of a ship slid beneath the surface, unhurried, and rose a little toward the light before it held there, turning. Out in all that cold, something had already noticed the girl in the windowless carriage. It began, slowly, to come closer. The carriage rolled for days. There was nothing to look at, so Amelia looked backward instead, into a life that was not this one, because she had done this before. She had died once already. Before Elmenia, before the veil, she had been someone else, in another world entirely. And in the dark of the carriage, that whole life came back to her at once, sharp as if it had happened yesterday. She had been a twin then. Her sister was called Vanessa, and Vanessa was the bright one, the pretty one, the girl a room rearranged itself around. Whatever the sick girl loved, Vanessa decided she wanted, and Vanessa got it. She would whine that her sister's things were nicer and that it was unfair, and their parents would hand them over to keep the peace. When something got broken, Vanessa cried, and the tears always decided the verdict. She would sob that she hadn't done it, that her sister had done it and was blaming her, and the parents believed the pretty one every single time. They would turn on the sick girl, cold and certain, and tell her to stop being selfish, to stop being so cruel to her poor sister, as if she were the crack running through the middle of the house. She was small. She learned early that being right did not matter if no one was on your side. Then the sickness came, the kind with no cure, and something in that house eased, as if a long-carried burden had finally set a date to leave. She spent her last years in a narrow hospital bed, reading books about animals mostly, whole encyclopedias of creatures she would never be allowed to touch, kept safe behind glass and distance. She read about horses and whales and birds until she knew them better than she knew her own family. Near the end, she asked very quietly whether anyone from home had come to see her. The answer was no. No one had come. No one was going to. She closed the book and she died in that bed alone. And then she had opened her eyes screaming, a newborn, in a great cold house in a kingdom called Elmenia, reborn as Amelia, daughter of Count Cain Reeves. For a while, as a child, she had let herself hope it would be different this time. It was not different. The Reeves family lived only to serve the crown, and there was no room left over in them for a daughter, a father who was an absence in the shape of a man, a brother she barely spoke to, a mother who looked straight through her toward the castle, and 17 years of being furniture in her own home. And then the summons, and the veil, and the bolt sliding home, twice now. 2 entire lives, and the same verdict handed down both times. Not wanted, easy to give away. Something in her went very cold, and very clear. She was not going to weep into a black veil and drown out there on schedule so that somebody else could be called holy. Let them wait for a corpse. She decided it plainly, the way you decide the weather, that she was going to live. And she made herself one promise in the dark, and held it like a stone in her fist. At the coast, they took her out of the carriage and onto a ship, and then they lowered her down into a small boat that carried no oars and no rower, an enchanted thing that would steer itself straight out to sea. Only then did the escort knight finally tell her the rest, and he told it almost gently, which somehow made it worse. He asked in a careful voice whether she knew of the Dragon Peninsula and the rite of cleansing. Then he explained it to her like a clerk reading terms. The princess, Carmilla, had insulted a foreign empire badly enough that blood was owed in return. Rather than pay that price herself, she would send a substitute to pay it for her. Anyone exiled to the peninsula who died there was was declared cleansed of the crown's sin. Anyone who somehow survived was called blessed. He mentioned kindly that no one ever survived. He told her not to take it personally. It was all for the good of the royal family. Amelia understood then exactly what she was for. A lying princess would be crowned a saint for surviving an island she would never set foot on. And to make that story true, the world needed a real girl to be sent there, and a real girl to die there, quietly, where no one would ever check. She was the corpse the lie required. It did not even matter that she looked nothing like the princess. Amelia had glimpsed Carmilla once at the castle, golden-haired and lovely, clinging to Tanya's arm and eyeing the substitute with open doubt, wondering aloud whether a girl so plainly different could really pass for her. But no one out here would ever hold the two of them side by side. The peninsula kept its dead. The story only needed her gone. She said nothing to the knight. There was nothing in him worth arguing with. He was only the hand. The whole kingdom was the blade. The boat pushed off on its own and carried her out toward the island. Behind her, the shore thinned to a pale line, and then to nothing at all. Alone on the water, she did not cry. She set her jaw against the wind and said the promise out loud so that at least the sea would hear it. "I am going to live," she said, "and then I am going to come back." She would survive whatever was out here that had killed everyone before her. She would learn it and use it. And when she was ready, she would walk back into that white castle and make the family that sold her and the crown that ordered it look straight at the girl they had thrown into the sea. She was 17 years old, soaked to the bone, and utterly alone on an ocean that wanted to swallow her whole. None of that changed anything. The promise was the only warm thing she had left, and she closed her hand around it and held on. It was not a prayer. It was a debt, and she had decided to be the one who collected it. Then the sea opened up in front of her. The water began to turn, a slow ring at first, then faster, tightening into a black throat that dragged everything toward its center. The little boat had nothing to fight it with. It spun, tipped, and went over, and Amelia was thrown into the cold. The sea closed over her head. Her veil, soaked heavy, wrapped itself around her face and hauled her down, and the daylight above her shrank to a coin, then a pinhole. She tore at the black cloth with both hands, kicked, clawed for the surface, and the water only pulled harder. Her chest burned for air. The pinhole began to go dark, and then, far below her, the dark itself moved. Something rose. It came up out of the deep like a mountain that had decided to stand, enormous, horned, its long body armored in a ridged shell, scales the color of deep water sliding past her through the murk. The whole ocean seemed to lift with it. It surged up beneath her, and she felt the water heave, felt herself rising fast, and then she broke the surface sprawled across the ridge of a vast head and gulped air like a thing being born. The dragon carried her up out of the whirlpool and into the open sky. Water sheeted off its horns and fell back to the sea in long silver ropes. It moved with a slow, impossible grace, nothing at all like the man-eating monster of every story she had ever been told, and it turned in the air, unhurried, and bore her toward the distant beach. She clung to it, coughing seawater, half drowned, and stared at the creature that had risen out of all that cold ocean and chosen, for reasons she could not begin to guess, to save her. The dragon set her down on the sand as gently as a hand setting down a cup. Amelia lay there soaked through, the torn veil gone, wet hair stuck across her face, and for a long moment she only breathed. She was alive. She was standing on the shore that no one ever came back from, and she was alive. Then something small dragged itself up out of the surf toward her. It was a young dragon, a smaller echo of the giant, with blunt turtle-like flippers and a wide, hopeful face. One of its flippers was snarled tight in a torn fishing net, the cord bitten deep into the skin where the little thing had fought against it and only pulled it tighter. It hauled itself up the sand to her and pushed the trapped flipper forward, plainly, the way a child shows a grown-up where it hurts. And all at once, Amelia understood. The great dragon had not pulled her from the sea by luck or by mercy. It had needed hands, human hands, thin, clever fingers, for a knot far too fine for any claw. It had gone out looking for a person, and out of the whole wide world, it had found the one girl her kingdom had thrown into the water like refuse, and it had decided that she would do. She got her fingers into the wet net and went to work. The cord was swollen and stiff and cruel, and it fought her, but she loosened it coil by coil, patient, until the last loop slid loose and the flipper came free. The baby dragon pushed its head into her chest and held it there, and the giant lowered its own huge horned head down beside her and rubbed it once against her shoulder. Gratitude, plain and unmistakable. The first warmth that either of her two lives had ever handed her without a price attached. She could have wept. Instead, she laughed, wet and shaking, her hand flat against the small one's back. She thought about everything behind her, the locked door, the turned key, a mother who saved every scrap of tenderness for a princess who was not even hers. And she thought about staying right here on a monster's beach with the only two creatures in either world that had ever wanted her enough to come and get her. It was not a hard choice. It was the easiest one she had ever made. "All right," she told them, and rested her hand on the small dragon's back. "I'll stay." So she stayed. She found fresh water and a dry place to sleep. And piece by clumsy piece, she taught herself to eat off the land and the tide. All those years spent reading about animals she could never touch turned out to be worth something after all. Out here, there was no glass between her and any of it, and no one left to tell her not to reach out her hand. She studied the dragons that the world called monsters. She watched how they moved and hunted, and how they seemed to speak to one another without ever making a sound. And slowly, over those long seasons, she learned the thing that would change everything. They listened to her. When she called, they came. They turned toward her and answered her hand in a way she could not yet explain, and in a way they did not answer any other living soul. And the years went by, one and then another, and then more, 7 of them in all, wearing the frightened girl off the beach away and leaving something else in her place, something the kingdom that killed her did not yet know was alive. They had thrown her away to die. Instead, they had handed her the one thing that no one in either of her lives had ever once let her keep. A place that was hers, a family that had chosen her, and she meant, when she was ready, to make every last one of them remember her name. 7 years later, a name was on every tongue in the kingdom of Elmania. It simply was not the right one. The bells rang for a saint. In the capital, they filled the cathedral square and knelt on the pale stone while Princess Carmilla stood above them in white and gold and told the story that had made her holy. She told it the way she always told it, that she had been sent to the Dragon Peninsula to answer for a terrible sin, that she had faced the man-eating dragons without running, that she had prayed to the very last for peace between 2 nations, and that as a great dragon opened its jaws to swallow her whole, she had heard, clear as a bell, the voice of God and been spared. The church called it a miracle. The people called her blessed. The crown's old crime, whatever it had been, was buried now under a girl's shining halo. There was one small problem with the story. Carmilla had never set foot on the peninsula. The girl who did, the one locked in a windowless carriage, veiled, rode out alone to die so a princess could be crowned for surviving it, had a different name, Amelia, daughter of Count Reeves, written into the family ledger as dead of a quiet illness, mourned by no one, and forgotten inside a single season. So the liars had already been paid in full. A crown of sainthood sat on the head of a girl whose one great deed was letting another girl be thrown away. The Reeves family had risen a rung at court on the strength of a dead daughter, and never once looked back at the grave they had no body for. And the girl they threw away was very much alive. She simply was not anywhere they would ever think to look. Down the coast, past waters no sane sailor crossed, a small woman was setting up a market stall and haggling over a bar of soap. 7 years in the wild had worked on her. She was 24 now, wind-weathered and quick-eyed. Her dark hair, long since gone, a tangled salt gray she never bothered to fix. She laid out the morning's catch on the boards, fish and shellfish, shrimp and squid, bright fruit and dried spice, all of it cold, impossibly cold, kept fresh by an ice trick no one on that poor coast could match, which made cheap seafood a luxury, and Amelia's stall the most interesting one in Port Haven. She did not want their coin. She wanted their small, dull things: paper, ink, soap, a few pairs of clean socks. She handed over a whole basket of fresh cold fish for 100 sheets of paper and 3 bottles of ink, and looked delighted at the bargain, because out where she lived, a stack of paper was worth more than any amount of gold. A stout housewife came by, the same one who always came, and weighed a cold slick fish in both hands with open wonder. "You're never afraid, traveling this coast on your own?" she asked. Amelia lifted one hand. A thread of white lightning crackled between her fingers, there and gone. "I manage," she said, and let the woman make of that what she liked. The housewife laughed, half startled, and pressed the other thing she always pressed, whether the girl ever actually came out ahead, trading fine fresh fish for old socks and a bar of soap. Amelia only shrugged and told her she came out exactly as far ahead as she wanted to. The little spark had not been hers at all. It belonged to the small, warm weight curled against her ribs, hidden inside her cloak, who had thrown it on cue. Trade done, and the crowd behind her, Amelia walked out to an empty curve of beach where no one would see, opened her cloak, and told the passenger it was safe to come out. Out he came, Sig, a dragon no bigger than a cat, a single slim horn on his brow, a pair of neat wings folding as he shook himself. The lightning had been his the whole time. He climbed to her shoulder and purred under her hand while she scratched the base of that horn. She had not taken him, or any of them, by force. That was the thing nobody would have believed. In her first hungry year, she had learned what each dragon loved to eat, and fed it, and waited, and let trust do the slow work no leash ever could. Sieg had turned out to be the friendliest of the lot. He rode in her cloak and answered her signals, and was, in a pinch, the best hidden weapon on the continent. Come on, she told him. Let's go home. She whistled once over the water, and the sea answered. It rose in a long, dark swell and became a dragon, Triton, the great blue-shelled sea serpent who had risen from the deep to save her from drowning 7 years ago and carried her to the peninsula. He had only grown vaster since. He surged up beneath her, now the size of a warship, horns curving back off a long neck, and lowered himself so she could climb onto the ridged shell of his back. Thank you for coming, she told him, patting the cool plate. There's a treat in it when we get home. A good one. He carried her out across the waves, and he went slow, the way he always did, to keep the ride easy for her. Amelia sat with her face to the wind and the spray, and let herself be, for one more quiet hour, the only person in the world living a life like this. No name to answer to, no family to please, no one who could sell her again. It was, she thought, without a trace of irony, the best thing that had ever happened to her. Then she saw it. Out on the flat, bright water, where nothing should have been, a great wooden ship sat broken in two, split down the middle and drifting, dead. It had not been there yesterday. It had no business being there today. Amelia leaned toward the sight the way she always leaned toward the strange, and told Triton to take her closer. The prince woke fighting a dream that had followed him his whole life. In it, he was a boy again in the Alboran court, a prince of common blood, son of a low-born mother, and no one there ever let him forget which half of him they despised. They mocked him. They kept him close and used him, passed him hand to hand like a coin, a convenient tool with royal blood and no one to protect it. And his mother, worn down year after year by that cold contempt, had sickened and slipped away and left him alone among people who wanted him gone. He came awake with the dream still on him, flat on his back, on hard cold stone, every joint aching, no idea on earth where he was. A small woman glanced over and noted dryly that he was finally awake. She did not explain gently. She had come across the broken ship adrift, she said, searched it, and walked the whole shoreline, and found the rest of his crew already dead. He was the only one left. She had carried him back here herself, with a dragon to help bear the weight. A dragon. The word landed in a man who trusted no one and had just been told everyone he sailed with was gone. Still half inside the nightmare, Julian's hand closed on a length of firewood, and he was on his feet with it raised, demanding to know who she was and what she had done with his crew. The threat did not last because something felt it. A dragon came up out of the trees behind the shelter, a huge four-legged beast, no wings, a broad cow-like head crowned with a pair of great forward-sweeping horns that lit with a faint cold glow. It had helped carry him in. Now it felt the hostility coming off him like heat off a fire, and it did not like it. It stalked closer, a growl building low in its chest. Julian saw it, and the word tore out of him raw, dragon, and the creature answered with a roar that shook the ground under both of them. Amelia crossed the distance and slapped him hard across the face. Breathe, she said. He gaped at her, the stick forgotten. Every scrap of that fear is pointing straight at him like a knife, and he can feel it. You settle down, or you get us both killed. Do it or die here, your choice. Then she turned her back on the raging dragon and walked right up to it. She spoke to it low, in a voice gone soft and easy, and laid one hand flat against its heaving shoulder, and dug something out of her pocket and offered it up. The glow along the horns dimmed. The growl wound down to nothing. The great head dipped into her palm, took the treat, and the whole terrible animal simply turned and lumbered back into the trees as if it had come by to say good morning. Julian lowered the wood very slowly. He had faced men and magic, and he could not have walked up to that thing to save his life. And this half-starved girl had done it with a word and a snack. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. "Julian," he said, "second prince of the Alberon Empire." He watched the tree line where the dragon had gone, then looked back at her, and he asked her, quietly, who she truly was. They sat among the rocks and put the pieces together, and the first piece was wrong in a way that made the back of Amelia's neck prickle. His ship had not been sunk by a storm or a monster, Julian said. He had been sailing home from a diplomatic mission when the vessel simply blew apart. Its own gunpowder stores, gone up all at once, in calm water, for no reason at all. He said it flatly, like a report, but gunpowder does not light itself. Someone had wanted the commoner blood prince dead, and had very nearly managed it. Amelia only confirmed the hard part quietly. She had walked the entire shore, and there had been no other survivors. He was still watching her sidelong, still half sure. How, he pressed, had she done that to the dragon? Had she bound it with some forbidden magic, made a slave of it? She almost laughed. Nothing was bound, she told him. Nothing was forced. Then she told him the truth, the real one, the secret at the bottom of everything she was. "They don't hear words," she said. "They hear what you mean, straight off your mind, the feeling, the picture, all of it, through the horn. Every dragon read intent that way," she explained. "To almost every human alive, a mind full of fear and noise, and I must not die, just read as a threat. A blade pointed their way, and a dragon with no predators in the world does not flee a threat. It removes it." That was the whole tragedy of it. People had been dying on the wrong end of a misunderstanding for centuries, but Amelia had spent 7 years learning to send her meaning across clean, to ask, to be understood, to be answered. It had started with Triton nosing fish up onto her rock when she was starving, and she had turned that one thread of trust into a fluent, two-way language with creatures each strong enough to break a battalion. She was not a scholar with a few tame pets. She was the one person breathing who could point dragons the way a general points soldiers. Julian repeated it back to her, slow, like a man testing ice. She hadn't controlled the dragon at all. It had cooperated because it had read her. He pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes and admitted the scale of it was making his skull ache. And no wonder. He had grown up in a court obsessed with power and blood, and here on a dead man's island sat a girl the world believed was a corpse, holding the one thing that could tip the whole balance between empires. Whoever had her had dragons, so he asked. It was presumptuous, he knew, but he had to get back fast, and he begged her to come with him, to Walkure, the frontier his uncle governed. A dragon had crossed out of the peninsula into human land for the first time in memory, and it sat there now, with a ring of soldiers around it, terrifying the whole territory, and not one of them could so much as approach it. He needed the one person alive who could walk up and be heard. For half a breath, something in Amelia went still and cold. Walkure meant human land, human courts, a step back toward the kind of people who put a girl in a windowless carriage and bolted the door. She had spent 7 years not thinking about them on purpose. Then Julian said the words "a dragon," and every careful, political, keep me out of it instinct in her went quiet. She had heard exactly one thing. A dragon? She was already on her feet. "You've been sitting here talking about shipwrecks and assassins, and you're only now telling me there's a brand new dragon nobody's ever studied?" Julian opened his mouth. "Don't. Pack whatever's yours," she said, and turned toward the shelter to grab her notes. Giddy as a child at the thought of a dragon she had never met. "We're leaving." And so the girl they had fed to the dragons started back toward the world that had thrown her away. Not for revenge, not yet, and not for any of them, for a dragon. But she was coming all the same, and she was bringing an army no one knew she had. The great sea dragon set them down on the far shore just after dawn, and slid back under the waves without a sound. Amelia stepped off onto strange sand, with her cloak still dripping, and grinned like a child let loose at a fair. She had not stood on the mainland in 7 years. She was not thinking about that. She was thinking about the pack. Julian steadied himself against a wet rock, still gray from the crossing, still in the salt-stiff ruin of his coat. Weeks ago, he had washed up half dead on her shore, and now he was walking her straight back into the world that had thrown her away. Neither of them said it. There was a dragon loose on the frontier that no soldier could touch, and to Amelia, that was the only fact worth carrying inland. They borrowed a covered wagon at the first village and set out for Otis, the walled fortress city that held the frontier. Amelia spent the whole rattling road interrogating him. What color were they? How long? How many horns? Julian, half laughing, told her to slow down and swore he would tell her everything he knew. "Reddish," he said, "a little bigger than horses. A pack of them had walked out of nowhere into the plains near the city about a month back, and here was the strange part. They had not attacked a single soul. That was all she needed. She named them before she had even seen one. running water fire dragons. Then she laid out the system she had built alone across 7 years, the thing no scholar anywhere possessed. 6 elemental orders, she counted off: earth and water and fire, wind and lightning and ice, crossed against 6 body shapes: the 4-legged and the running and the winged, the finned and the many-headed and the serpent. Every dragon alive dropped into one box in that grid. The little one asleep in her cloak was lightning and winged. The sea dragon was water and long-necked. A reddish pack that ran on 2 legs and breathed fire could only be running and fire, so she had a species and a guess before the wagon ever stopped. A guess she could test was worth more to her than any crown a margrave might offer. At the gates, a guard took one look at Julian, whose ship had been due the day before and never made port, and bolted to fetch his lord. Margrave Cedric came down fast for a man of his rank. He was the emperor's own younger brother, stripped of his imperial place and sent to rule this frontier. Stern-faced and dry, and for a moment all the statecraft fell off him. He gripped his nephew by both shoulders, plainly and simply, grateful the boy was alive. Then he turned to the wild girl who had pulled the prince out of the sea and offered her anything she cared to name. Tea came. Amelia ate the little cakes with the quiet reverence of a woman who had lived 7 years on roasted game and raw fish, and let Julian tell the story. When the margrave pressed the reward a second time, land, coin, a title, whatever she wished, she set down her cup. "I don't want any of that," she said. "Take me to the dragons, now." Cedric studied her for a long moment. A girl in a road-worn cloak, turning down a fortune to go stand in front of the one thing his whole army was afraid of. He asked carefully whether she truly meant to walk right up to them. She was already on her feet. The army stood in a wide ring around the pack, spears out, and had stood that way for a month without moving an inch. As Amelia came up, one of the soldiers looked the small gray-haired girl over and said what plainly everyone was thinking, that there was nothing a slip of a thing like her could do about dragons. Julian opened his mouth to vouch for her, to tell them he had watched her calm a raging dragon with his own eyes. He never finished. Amelia twitched her cloak aside, and a small horned head poked out at her collar, blinked its round gold eyes at the soldier, and gave a wide bored yawn. The man went white. The words died in his throat, and they died in the throats of everyone standing near him. That was the end of the argument. Then she turned and walked into the ring alone. She walked in unarmed, straight toward creatures that could run down a company of soldiers, and she was smiling the whole way. 18 of them, reddish, 3-horned, lean, and fast as hunting hounds. Exactly the running fire kind she had named in the wagon. They braced as she came, low warning notes rolling out of their throats, one of them flaring a mouthful of flame into the air. She read the way they stood and understood it in a heartbeat. This was not a hunt. It was a wall. They were guarding something, not stalking anyone. She had a way to be certain. Years back, a grinning stranger down in the harbor village had taught her a forbidden scrap of clairvoyance she had no license to use, and she used it now without a flicker of guilt. It showed her the middle of the pack. One of the females carried a great egg low in her belly, close to laying. That single fact explained the whole month. The pack had not stayed to make war. It had stayed because it would not leave a mother behind. So she reached for them the only way that mattered, straight through the horns, sending no words, only a clean wave of meaning. Calm, no harm. "I will drive the spears back so she can bring her young into the world in peace." The warning notes sank and went quiet. The flame guttered out. All across the ring, something wound tight for a month let go at once. She came back and told them the truth of it. The pack would never abandon the pregnant female, so no wall of spears would ever move it, and forcing the matter would only start a battle no one won cleanly. Julian's relief soured the instant she mentioned the clairvoyance. "That spell was a third-class forbidden magic," he protested, licensed for a reason, and she had just cast it in the open in front of the whole border command. Cedric set a hand on his nephew's shoulder and waved the worry off. "This was an emergency," he said mildly, "with lives in the balance and no harm done. A poor time to punish a girl over a paperwork sin. He would carry the responsibility himself." Then Amelia gave them her plan, and it was not a battle at all. Once the egg was safely laid, she would guide the whole pack home, back across to the Dragon Peninsula where dragons belonged, and the frontier would have its grassland returned without a single death on either side. "Pull the soldiers off," she told them. "Leave only watchers. The rest was hers to handle." What she did not say aloud was that the chance to witness a birth no human had ever recorded had left her nearly breathless. Cedric looked at the prince, then at the girl, and handed her the whole operation. Far wiser, he told his officers, to set a real expert at the center of a thing they knew nothing about. They hated it. He overruled every one of them. That night, she slept in a real bed for the first time in 7 years. The little dragon curled warm against the pillow, and in the morning, she very nearly walked out the door with her hair in a wild gray thicket. Julian caught her in the corridor and looked genuinely pained. "You cannot honestly mean to go out looking like that," he said. She pointed out that the dragons would not care how neat her hair was, so long as she did not stink. He sat her down on a bench anyway and brushed the tangles out himself, quick and sure, the hands of a man who had done it 1,000 times. When she asked which servant had taught him such a deft touch, he answered flatly that he kept no attendants and did everything himself. And then, smoothly, he turned the talk to something else. She noticed the door he had just shut. She let him keep it shut. There would be time for that later. Out at the herd, she stopped Julian at a safe distance. She would go the rest alone, she told him. It was too dangerous otherwise, and walked in close to the mother dragon. Then she did the thing that had kept her alive for 7 years. She lifted her hands and pulled the loose mana out of the air, fire attribute, pure, and pressed it until it hardened into a solid stone the size of a melon, glowing a deep ember red. She held it out on her palm. 3 dragons broke from the pack, passed it teeth to teeth, and carried it to the gravid female. And the great creature swallowed it whole, the way a child takes a sweet, and swung her head around looking for another. Julian stared like a man watching the world rearrange itself. Amelia, delighted, laid out the secret she had been piecing together for years, the thing not one army on Earth understood. "Dragons don't eat meat," she said. "They don't eat anything that bleeds or grows. They eat magic." They were mana eaters, all of them, and each kind hungered for the mana that matched its own nature. Fire drawn to fire, lightning to lightning. And she had only just nailed down the last of the proof. She admitted, half a laugh in it, that in 7 whole years she had never once actually watched a dragon eat. So she had gone hunting the way she hunted everything, looking for the leavings, bones, carcasses, droppings, the mess any predator leaves in its wake. She had found nothing, not a gnawed bone, not one dropping, not a trace, a body that left no waste at all because it burned magic and burned it clean. Then she had watched one gulp a raw magic stone straight out of the dirt, and the whole thing had locked shut in her mind. Julian went red and sputtered that she had spent the entire morning talking of nothing but crude and unmentionable things, and then he stopped short because he had followed it to the end himself. If dragons ate magic, and a mage could shape magic by hand, then the glowing stone in her palm was no trick. It was food, and food you could forge was food you could carry, and stockpile, and hold out to any dragon alive until it followed your hand across the world. Quietly, he said they were like the spirits out of the old stories. She was not listening. She was already forging the next stone. Over the days that followed, she made them by the armful, and not only fire. She forged them in all 6 colors, one for every element in her grid: ember red, deep water blue, earth brown, pale wind green, lightning gold, and ice white. A whole ring of keys, one for every kind of dragon that had ever braced itself against a human. Bait, reward, and wage, all sitting in the palm of one hand. She hand-fed the wary mother across 4 patient days until the beast would lift a stone from her fingers without a single flare of warning. The Margrave's household sent out a tent and a fine spyglass, and Amelia set up on the rise to watch. Julian swore he would ride back every few days with fresh supplies and carry any message she had. For 4 days, she barely slept, welded to the glass, while the herd drew close together and settled into a shared clutch. On the 4th day, the mother laid, and the whole pack laid around her. 3 eggs, warm and pale, nestled together in the flattened grass. Amelia looked at them the way other people look at treasure. She was not leaving, she told Julian, not until every one of them hatched. She had missed the birth of every dragon she had ever loved, and she would not miss this. And somewhere beneath all the wonder, the arithmetic of the frontier had quietly turned over. A month ago, Walcure had 18 dragons it could not move and dared not kill. Now it had a girl who could feed the whole pack from her open hand, a food she could forge in 6 colors for any dragon under the sky, 3 eggs about to hatch under her private watch, and a Margrave who answered to the Emperor himself, calling her the center of the plan. She had crossed back into the world of the people who had sold her, carrying one small dragon hidden in her cloak. She meant to leave it carrying an army, and the next time that world came looking for the girl it threw away, it was going to find her standing at the head of them, holding the leash. 10 days after the clutch was laid, Amelia had not slept in 3. She did not count that as a hardship. She had crept her tent closer to the herd a hand's width at a time until she was near enough to touch them, and now she sat cross-legged in the grass with a strip of dried meat held out on her palm, feeding the mother dragon by hand. The great reddish head dipped and took the food from her fingers, careful as a plow horse. Amelia stroked its cheek. The scales there were startlingly soft, warm from the body heat these creatures held under their armor, and she had won this, a wild fire dragon eating out of her hand, in about 4 days. 4 days still amazed her. Then, hooves on the rise. Julian rode up, and she watched his face do the thing it always did when he found her in the field, which was to fall. He swung down, took one look at the tangled silver hair and the grime and the dark bruises under her eyes, and told her flatly that she looked like something dug out of a ditch. She handed him 3 days of notes instead of answering. Thick pages, dense script, the mother sketched in every posture, the eggs measured hour by hour. He took them, and she watched him forget the lecture for a moment as he turned the pages, impressed against his will. Then he remembered himself. "When did you last sleep?" he asked, not looking up. "I have been busy." He said the shadows under her eyes deepened by the day, and that he would carry her to the wash screens over one shoulder if she made him. She informed him that he was overstepping, and that she would file a formal complaint against the second prince of the empire for interfering with a researcher at work. It was, she thought, a fairly good threat, coming from a researcher who smelled like a wet animal, aimed at a prince who was only trying to help. A woman soldier came up the slope before he could answer. She apologized for the interruption and handed Julian a sheaf of documents, the steward's papers on Carriage, the olive village he had governed since he came of age, his first real charge on the border. He took them and eased back half a step as he did, a small guarded motion, there and gone. Amelia filed it away and forgot it, because behind them, in the warm hollow the mother had left, the 3 eggs had begun to rock. She was on her feet at once. She was not going anywhere now. The first shell split with a sound like green wood cracking. A wet snout pushed through, then a whole small head, blinking at a world it had never seen. The second egg went, then the third. 3 hatchlings shouldered out of their shells, no bigger than house cats, slick and unsteady, crying in high, thin voices that cut clean through the morning. The mother lowered her head over the 3 of them and went still, watching. One of them got its legs under it, swayed, stood, and loosed a tiny puff of flame into the air, a spit of fire no longer than a finger, as if it were cheering itself on. Amelia did not make a sound. She sank down where she stood and looked, and she burned every part of it into memory. The wet dark scales, the order they hatched in, the first small flame, the way a girl who had spent a past life confined and ill had learned to hold on to animals by looking at them hard enough, because some things come once and never come back. Beside her, Julian had gone quiet too. Then the hatchlings tried to walk, and she stopped being tender and started counting minutes. Within minutes of breaking their shells, the 3 were up and staggering forward, and Amelia's stillness cracked open into something sharper. She had seen this before, newborn wyvern kind that took to the air within an hour of hatching, and she knew exactly what it meant. Newborn dragons travel almost at once. These 3 would be able to cross within the hour, which meant the window she had waited 10 days for had just opened, and it would not stay open long. Every hour on the frontier was another hour the herd sat within reach of the Gadres forest and everything in it. "Julian," she was already moving. "Send the word down the line. Final positions. All of it. Now. We move today." He did not argue with her, which was new. He caught the horse, swung up, and was gone down the slope shouting the order. And behind him, the mother dragon lifted her head and loosed a roar that Amelia felt land in her own chest like a struck drum. The herd answered the roar and ran. 18 fire dragons came up out of the grass at once and poured across the plain, away from the dark tree line of the forest, and the ground drummed under them. Grown ones outpaced a galloping horse without trying, but they kept slowing, wheeling back again and again to shepherd the 3 hatchlings stumbling in the middle of the pack. And that was the gap that let Amelia and Julian ride hard and overtake the front. They rode double, the prince at the reins, Amelia at his back, with her eyes half shut. She reached out the way she always did, through the horns, and pressed her intent into the whole running mass at once. This way, not that way. The danger is behind you. The better food is where I am taking you. It was not words. It was a shape she leaned into their minds, and the herd felt the shape and trusted it, and the head of the column began to bend after the horse. She turned them wide of the forest road, clear of the Gadra's tree line, where every other thing that would happily eat a hatchling made its home, and aimed the whole thundering line at Port Haven and the open sea. "They actually follow you," Julian said over his shoulder, not for the first time, still not used to it. "They follow the better idea," she said. "I am only the one holding it." Ahead, where the land ran out into water, the soldiers and the mages had been busy. She had asked Cedric for this weeks back, a second way across to the peninsula that did not run through the forest, and he had built it for her. The strait lay frozen from coast to coast, a bridge of solid sea ice 100 paces wide, its surface scattered thick with sand so nothing could slip. Mages posted along its length to keep it cold. The herd poured down the shingle and onto the ice without breaking stride. The column streamed out over deep water. The hatchlings rode in the middle of it, walled in on every side by adults. Amelia and Julian pressed ahead near the front. Below the ice, the strait ran down dark and cold and very deep, and she kept her mind spread wide over the herd, holding the line steady. And that was how she felt the sea change before anyone saw a thing. The water at the edge of the bridge was pulling back, sliding off the ice the wrong way, gathering, drawing down the way the sea draws down just before something underneath it comes up. And through the same sense that had once read an unborn dragon curled inside its shell, she felt the shape of it now, a mass moving in the deep, enormous, rising toward the light. She did not stop the herd. A column strung out thin on a narrow bridge was a target. A column frozen in place was a dead one. Scatter them, and the hatchlings in the middle went first. So she pushed one clean order the length of the whole line and held it there with everything she had. Keep moving. Whatever comes out of the water, do not break, do not stop. And 18 adults locked their trust onto her and kept running. Amelia. Julian had felt the horse balk under him, seen the sea heaving off the ice. His voice came out very level, which was how she knew he was afraid. "Something is coming up." "I know," she said. "Keep the road in front of us. Do not look at it." The kraken came out of the strait like a mountain deciding to stand up. The sea broke apart, and a vast dark thing hauled itself into the light, tall as a ship's mast and then taller, seawater sheeting off it in falls that came down like rain. Its bulk swallowed the sun over the bridge and dropped the whole crossing into shadow. This was the thing the sailors did not come back from, the beast fast enough and huge enough to crack a great ship in half and pull the pieces down into the dark. It reared over the ice, over the running herd, over the hatchlings in the middle of the line, and it came down at them. Amelia did not flinch. She did not reach for a blade. There was no blade in the world that would have mattered against that. She lifted her head, opened her mind all the way down to the floor of the strait, and put one word into the deep. "Come." The water answered. Something rose under the kraken that made the kraken look small. The whole strait heaved and swelled and stood up, and Triton came out of the sea. Her great sea dragon, warship-sized, deep blue and teal, 2 long horns and a body like a moving reef, the ocean pouring off his shell in a roar you could feel in your teeth. He blotted out the kraken the way the kraken had blotted out the sun. She had crossed open water on that back. He was the same dragon that had risen for her out of a drowning sea 7 years ago and carried her to shore. He opened his jaws and the sea came with them. What broke out of Triton was not a spray or a stream. It was the strait itself thrown in a single direction. A wall of water loosed all at once like a great levee giving way. So much force in one breath that the air went white and the sound flattened everything else. It struck the kraken full on. The great beast did not survive the current. One instant it towered over the bridge, and the next the sea simply closed flat over the place where it had been, and the water fell still, and it was gone. The bridge shuddered hard in the wake. It held. Spray rained down over the running herd, and the herd, because Amelia had told them to, and because by now they trusted her more than they feared the sea, never broke stride. Triton sank back beneath the strait as quietly as he had risen. Amelia was already looking ahead at the far shore. Somewhere under her focus, a small, flat, practical voice was noting that she owed him a high-purity waterstone for that, the good, clear kind, and that she would forge it the moment her hands were free. Julian had not breathed in some time. "Eyes on the road," she said, without turning around. "We are not across yet." The herd came off the ice onto the black shingle of the peninsula and did not stop. 18 adults and 3 hatchlings poured up the shore and into the wild green land beyond. home, on ground, no army would follow them onto. At the tree line, the lead dragon turned, lifted her head, and cried out once, a long high note back across the strait. Then the herd was gone into the trees, and the beach was empty, and it was over. Amelia slid down off the horse and stood in the surf noise, filthy and swaying and grinning at nothing. She had done what she came to do. The herd was safe. 3 new hatchlings had crossed alive. As far as she was concerned, she had simply been allowed to spend 10 days doing the one thing she loved most in the world, and she could not for the life of her understand why the prince kept looking at her like that. Julian dismounted and told her plainly that without her, the whole thing would have collapsed into chaos. The standoff, the crossing, the monster in the strait, all of it, that she had just saved a stretch of the border and everyone standing on it. And would she, for one single time in her life, simply accept the thanks? She considered it. "You are welcome," she said, which was not what he meant, and was the best she had. He held her eyes a moment longer. Then he grimaced, stepped back, and informed her that she smelled like a wild animal that had been rolled in a second wild animal, and that she would bathe the instant they were back across the ice if he had to stand watch at the screen himself. "Overstepping," she said. "Filing your complaint," he said, and swung back up into the saddle. She climbed up behind him, and they started back across the ice toward the mainland, back toward the world that had thrown her away, though that world did not yet know she was walking around in it. She was not thinking about that world. She was thinking about 3 new hatchlings and a water stone she owed a sea dragon, and how much larger all of this could still get. Behind her, the strait lay flat and blue and empty, as though nothing had ever risen out of it at all. The table Cedric set for her had nothing silver on it. He had laid it out the way a fisherman's wife might: a wide pot of seafood stew, dark bread, a shallow dish of oil, because he had guessed rightly that a woman who had eaten off the Dragon Peninsula for 7 years would sit easier at a plain table than a fine one. Amelia noticed the kindness and said nothing about it, which was its own sort of thanks. She just ate. "This oil is from carriage," she said, tipping her spoon at the dish. "It's good." Cedric allowed that it was very good, and somehow did not say where it had come from, and she marked the little dodge and let it slide. Julian sat across from her, stiff as a fence post, and he had been stiff as a fence post all night. He barely touched his food. Every time the talk drifted towards something ordinary, he braced as if a door were about to open, and Amelia, chewing, watched him do it and grew more entertained by the minute. Then Cedric set down his cup, and the warmth went out of the room by a few degrees. The Albaran Empire, he told her, was not well. The old emperor had died more than a year ago, a cruel, dissolute man who had wasted away slowly from an illness no physician could name, and his death had done what his life never managed. It had cracked the realm open. The great houses had split behind rival princes, and the pieces were grinding against each other in a war of succession with no clean end in sight. Cedric and Julian stood behind the first prince, Leon, a son of the empress out of a powerful ducal line. To hold that ground, they needed strength the other factions could not match. Then Cedric bowed his head to her, a border lord bowing to a commoner across a supper table, and asked the question the whole evening had been circling. Could dragons be tamed for war? Julian's knuckles went white on the edge of the table. He had plainly spent the day dreading how she would take it. Amelia set down her spoon and said yes. Not gently, not with a speech, just yes, the way you agree to lend a neighbor a ladder. Power over dragons did not read to her as good or evil. It was a fact, like weather, and what men chose to do with it was their business to answer for, not hers to bless. She did not count using animals in a war as a sin. If it could be done, she said, then someone would do it, and the ones who did should own every last part of the cost. That was all. The 2 men stared at her. She had knocked the wind clean out of a speech they had braced all night to deliver. Julian recovered first and admitted, almost accusing, that he had been certain she would refuse, that anyone who looked at dragons the way she did could only have loved them too much to arm them. That was when she decided to enjoy herself. She leaned her chin on her hand and asked sweetly exactly how old he was, because he frowned like a man of 40 and lectured like one too, and surely no one so young could be so joyless. Julian's ears went red. He informed her that she, of all living people, had no standing to call anyone else grim, and then, goaded past his dignity, he reached across and pinched her cheeks. Amelia let him, grinning through it. Across the table, Cedric watched the 2 of them squabble like a pair of children and did nothing to stop it, and something in his stern face had gone quietly warm. One kingdom away, at that same hour, another young woman was being loved by thousands. They had dressed Carmilla in white and gold and set her up above the crowd, and the crowd adored her, the saint who had walked onto the Dragon Peninsula and walked back off it alive, blessed by heaven, living proof that Elminia was favored. She smiled and lifted her hand, and the people wept for her. Every word spoken of her was worship, and every word she gave back was gentle and holy and a lie, because all of it was built on a girl she had never met dying in her place. But under the cheering, down in the low places where rumor breeds, a new whisper had begun to move. A few voices, no more, asking a small and dangerous question. What if the girl they had sent to the peninsula to die had not died at all? It was nothing yet. It was one loose thread in a very large tapestry, and Carmilla, high above the crowd in her borrowed halo, could not hear it, but it had started. By the next morning, the teasing was gone, and the terms were on the table. Amelia laid out where she stood, plainly. She would give them everything she knew and every warning she had, but she would not bless the war, and she would not fight it. Each man who reached for a dragon would answer for that risk himself. Then she told them why she meant it, and it came out sounding like a lecture on fish. Protect one creature too well, she said, and you wreck the whole web that holds it. Guard the whales until they overrun the water, and the fish are stripped bare, and the sharks come hungrier and closer, and the thing you saved drowns everything around it. Even the lowest, meanest creature had a place that held the rest in balance. Dragons were no different, only far more dangerous than anything else alive, and anyone who forgot that would pay for it. She said it about ecosystems. She had, without seeming to notice at all, just described a girl thrown away as worthless by people who thought her the lowest thing in the room. Cedric and Julian took her terms as given. Then she asked, almost shy under the bluntness, whether the help might run the other way too. Whether there was any chance of support for her research. There was. Cedric told her a facility would be raised for her at Audis, a real one, walls and workrooms and staff, and that she would be free to summon scholars from every discipline she pleased. Botanists, engineers, people who counted and measured for a living. Amelia lit up like a struck match. For 7 years, she had run into the same wall over and over. Things she could see and could not explain. Questions one mind could not crack alone. Whole rooms of knowledge she had no key to. It had been the loneliest part of the work, and now a man was calmly offering to hand her the keys. She thanked Cedric with a warmth she almost never spent on people, and left the study nearly floating, her head already 3 problems ahead. When the door shut behind her, the room changed. Cedric did not speak for a moment. Then he said the thing that had been sitting under the whole arrangement, quietly, the way a man tests thin ice. They knew almost nothing about her. No family on any record, no hometown anyone could name. A woman with impossible knowledge of dragons who had simply appeared on the Dragon Peninsula 7 years ago, young and alone, an exile, and gone unclaimed by the world ever since, as though no one had ever come looking for her. Julian had been circling the same emptiness for weeks. Standing there in the quiet study, he finally set the pieces down in a row and looked at what they made. 7 years ago, he said, there had been a scandal. At an international gathering, the sickly 4th princess of the Albaran court, Tia, had been shoved down a short flight of steps and hurt. The one who pushed her was a princess of Elminia, Carmilla. Elminia had refused at first to give up anyone at all and had nearly broken the peace over it. And then, rather than surrender their glittering Saint Candidate, they had settled the debt another way. They had taken a disposable girl, a girl no one would miss, and exiled her to the Dragon Peninsula as penance in Carmilla's place, sent her there to die. And when the death was assumed and the books were closed, they had crowned Carmilla the saint who survived the peninsula. Holy, heaven-blessed, adored, for an ordeal she had never once endured. Julian said it low, and Cedric went very still, because the timeline was not merely close. It was exact. A young girl cast onto that peninsula 7 years ago. A young woman who had walked out of those same 7 years knowing dragons the way no living person should. The girl Elminia had thrown away to die had not died. She had spent the evening teasing Julian about his age across a bowl of stew. Neither man said her name and the word saint in the same breath. They did not have to. The fraud a whole kingdom knelt to sat in the room with them now, named and undeniable. And it belonged, if they were right, to the woman who had just floated out the door thinking about botanists. And they would say nothing to her. That was the first thing they agreed on, and they agreed on it fast. A truth like this was a blade, and there were a dozen hands that would use it against her long before they ever used it for her. Elminia to silence her, rival factions to seize her, a church to bury her. Speak it carelessly, and it could get her killed. So they would hold it, not as a secret kept from her, but as a secret kept for her, until they understood exactly what it was worth and who it could hurt. Then Cedric looked at his nephew and said the other thing, and it landed harder than he meant it to. Julian was cold with women, always had been. guarded to the point of rudeness. And yet with this one, he argued and sulked and let himself be teased pink at the ears like a boy who had found a friend. Cedric had noticed. He wanted Julian to know he had noticed. Julian did not have an answer for that. For once in his careful life, the prince said nothing at all. Some days later, the moving began. Amelia had asked Cedric to help haul 7 years of research off the peninsula and into Audis, and he had agreed before she finished the sentence. He lent her rooms to store it in the meantime and sent Julian along to carry the crates, and, more to the point, to see the place with his own eyes. She had handed the Margrave one more thing first, a list, drawn up overnight, of which dragons were fit for riding and which for stabling, sorted by temper and use. He had read it and judged it good enough to build an army on. Now Julian stood in a mid-sized boat that no one was rowing, gripping the rail, watching the water tear past far faster than any sail had a right to pull it. Triton was towing them. The great sea dragon ran just under the surface ahead, warship huge and unbothered, the boat skating along in his wake, and Julian kept looking from the smooth green water to the back of Amelia's head, and back again, as though one of them would eventually explain itself. "It's really swimming," he said. "It's swimming and towing us, and it's faster than a yacht." He said it 3 times over in slightly different words, and each time Amelia answered without turning around, telling him yes, that was the general idea, and that he might want to sit down and think about what that meant for every harbor and every ship in the empire before his mouth outran his head. He thought about it. She watched him think about it and enjoyed the view. The peninsula did not look like the death every map called it. Amelia led him inland along a path only she seemed to know, explaining as she went that she did not really ride the dragons, and that none of them were tamed and none of them were hers. They were free. They simply helped her when their paths crossed, the way neighbors help. Julian filed that away with the sidelong look of a man who suspected she was less a colleague than something wild that had wandered in out of the trees, and kept the thought to himself. Then the path opened, and he met Marta. Marta was enormous and slow and gentle, a mountain of a dragon with a cluster of long swaying necks and a broad-shelled back. And out of that shell, roots and all, grew a full and living fruit tree. Amelia reached up, picked something ripe, and told him plainly that this dragon had kept her alive. For 7 years, when there was nothing else, there had been Marta's fruit, grown by magic. Every kind of fruit there was, traded for the magic stones the dragon liked. She said she would have starved down to bones without it. Julian looked at a tree growing out of a living creature and said, faintly, that a dragon like this could answer a famine, feed a whole starving province through a hard winter. Amelia agreed that it probably could, and then, because he had not suffered enough, drew a knife and held it up. The blade had been cut from a dragon's own claw. It sheared through branch and vine and meat as if they were water, and the claw was only the start of it. There was hide that could be worked into fine cloth and fur and more. Every part of a dragon was worth something to someone. Julian put up both hands and begged her, honestly begged her, to stop talking before his head came apart. Amelia laughed and let him breathe. She had, in a single afternoon, quietly overturned everything the prince thought he knew about the monsters at the edge of the map. And 1 kingdom away, the people who had thrown her onto this shore to die still believed they had won. The 2 men who had guessed the truth were holding it close, saying nothing, watching and waiting. And Amelia, reaching up to pick a second piece of fruit off the back of a dragon, did not yet know that anyone had guessed it all. The smoke went up over the olive village before the ship had even finished docking. Amelia saw it first, a black column leaning over Carriage, and she was still stacking the last crates of 7 years of research when a border soldier came galloping down the pier. He shouted that a fire had taken the windbreak forest, and that the water mages had been throwing spells at it for an hour, and the flames only fed and grew. Julian went very still. Carriage was olive country, oil country, the village that had promised her its whole harvest, and something in him that ran deeper than duty snapped tight. He turned to go so fast he drove his own nails into his palm hard enough to split the skin, and did not seem to notice the blood. "Stop," Amelia said, catching his wrist. "You will kill a horse before you get there, and a horse is not fast enough anyway." She had something faster. From the folds of her cloak, the little lightning dragon, Zeke, slid out, no bigger than a cat, and she fed it a charge and let it throw its horn call wide across the plain. The signal mimicked the thought cry of dragon young, and the land answered. A herd of fire-running dragons came pouring out of the tree line, lean and crimson, and built like sprinters. 3 of them, the small ones she and Julian had helped once, grown startlingly since. "You are not going to like this," she told him, swinging up onto a bare crimson back. No saddle, no reins, gripping with her knees. Hold the neck. Do not let go, Julian asked, in the strangled voice of a man who already regretted everything. Whether this was in any conceivable way the correct method, it was not. She grinned and told him so. Then the fire-running dragons went from standing still to the speed of a racing train in the space of a breath, and the port and the sea and the prince's shouting all fell away behind them. The fire was worse up close, and it was wrong. Water spells hit it and died. The flames had gone down into the roots and were eating the forest from underneath, where no bucket and no spell could reach, and they were crawling toward the olive groves and the houses beyond. Villagers ran with what they could carry. Somebody looked up, screamed that dragons were coming, and pointed at the sky. Amelia had not brought water. Water was the wrong element for a fire that lived in the ground. Cold was the answer, and cold was what she called. Down out of the frozen peaks, where no dragon had ever once come off that land, 11 ice dragons came flying. They were white-scaled, and every one of them built differently. Some like great four-legged oxen, some like wyverns. One a vast serpent that poured through the air in coils, and the air went bitter and silver just from the beat of their wings. She and Julian rode in on the serpent one, the hardest mount of all of them, and Julian clung to it through his first true flight, while Amelia sat the freezing coils as easy as a bench. Over the burning forest she gave the command. The 11 dragons folded their wings and dove, and they breathed. It was not fire they answered with, it was winter. A wall of blizzard broke over the whole windbreak at once, a roar of white that snuffed the flames not slowly, but all together, in a single held instant, like a candle pinched between two fingers. The heat vanished. The smoke froze and fell. Where the fire had been, there stood a forest turned to glass. Every blackened branch sheathed thick in frost, the whole ruined wood glittering hard and blue and silent under the pale dragons wheeling above it. For one long moment, nobody down in Kirid made a sound. They only stared up at a girl who had answered an impossible fire with an impossible cold and won. Then the dragon settled, and Julian stepped down in front of the whole stunned village and thanked her out loud, by name, plainly, for saving his people a second time. Amelia felt the tips of her ears go hot. Down in the crowd, the murmur had already started. The word doctor, the word saint, passed hand to hand, and she wanted no part of either. She turned to the practical thing instead, paying the 11 dragons their magic stones, quietly borrowing on the border mage's spent power to make up what her own could not cover. It kept her hands busy. It kept her from having to look at the way the villagers were looking at her, and it kept her, for a little while, from the other thing, the cold thing under all the relief. There had been no lightning, no fire beast, no spark, no lamp, no natural cause at all. A forest does not simply go up like that, feeding on its own roots, refusing water. Somebody had lit Kirid on purpose. She did not say it aloud, but she filed it away, and it did not stop bothering her. By the time she came back into the Walkure town from her next long stint on the peninsula, filthy and loaded with specimens, the whole place had made up its mind about her, and it could not agree. A fruit seller tossed her an apple and called her doctor, warm as anything, and asked if she had been out to the dragons again. 2 steps later, a soldier snapped to attention and thanked the saint for her service at the fire. Half the town had settled into the doctor camp and half into the saint camp, and neither one would give the titles up no matter how she batted them away. A small girl planted herself in Amelia's path, wide-eyed, and asked in a hush whether it was true, whether the kind big sister was really the saint from the old story, the one who long ago calmed a dragon with a sermon of love. "I am not a saint," Amelia told her, as gently as she could manage while dying inside. "I am not that sort of person, even a little. What I am is a woman who wants to get back to her microscope." The trouble, she had learned, was Julian. When the people asked who had put out the fire, he had told them the truth, her name, all of it, refusing on principle to steal or bury another person's work. Honest to a fault, and his honesty had dressed her in a holy costume she never asked for. It stung worse than an insult would have. Being anyone's symbol was the exact opposite of the one thing she had ever wanted, which was to be looked at and seen as herself and nothing else. Julian found her mid-street, took in the state of her, and marched her off toward a bath over her loud and undignified protest. She needled him that he was hopeless with women, really hopeless, and he did not deny it. He only said, stiff and plain and a little pink, that she was different, that setting family aside, he had never once felt about anyone the way he felt about her, like some wild stray thing that had wandered up and become the only real friend he had. It landed somewhere she was not braced for, and she covered it with a joke. Then, she paid him back with the actual news. Cedric had given an order. The dragon riding unit finally had its candidates, and Amelia was to help the second prince stand it up and lead its first expedition out to the peninsula to win the march its first true partner dragons. While she scrubbed dragon muck off her arms and argued about titles, her name was leaving her. She did not feel it go, but a deed like carriage does not stay in one village. Word of the girl who commanded dragons went outward the way water finds every crack, to the Empress's faction first and hardest, then to rival princes, to merchant houses counting what a dragon's claw was worth, to the northern and southern churches, to foreign courts, and at last, one kingdom away, to the royal house of Elminia, and the loyal count who had once served it so well, the count named Reeves. The very people who had folded a disposable daughter into a windowless carriage and shipped her off to die were beginning, without knowing it, to hear tell of what she had become. And in Elminia, they still had their saint, draped in white and gold, lifted above weeping crowds. The princess who had never set foot on the peninsula was worshipped for surviving it, blessed by the southern church, her lie growing heavier and holier by the season. A false saint crowned in one country for an ordeal she never endured, while in another country, the woman who had actually endured it was fighting off the same word in a muddy street and hating it. Somewhere in the imperial palace ahead of her, past the Empress's own rooms, a young princess lay wasting under an illness that no physician could touch. Amelia had never heard her name. She would soon enough. She did not know that either. She knew none of it. She was busy and happy, and one careful step at a time, her legend was walking straight back toward the hands that had thrown her away. Triton towed them across the strait, and then they climbed. Amelia led Julian and 5 battle-tested soldiers up onto the plateau where the beginner's dragons ran. Not flyers, she and Julian had agreed. Nothing a green rider could fall off of and die. They wanted the green-feathered running dragons, wind-attribute landrunners, solitary and sharp-minded and level-tempered, with a knack for reading exactly how a rider felt. Safe for dragons, willing to trade help for magic stones, never owned, only partnered. One of the herd came to her before she called. Sigurd, green-plumed, an old scar still down one leg where she had healed a wound years ago, pressed his big head flat against her chest in greeting, and then agreed to lead them into the rest. The soldiers gaped at a wild dragon nuzzling their expert like a hound. Julian went first, and Julian went about it exactly wrong. He drew himself up before a chosen dragon, produced a contract sealed with Cedric's own stamp, and delivered a grave and formal oration about mutual obligation and imperial honor. The dragon looked at him. The dragon yawned. Then the dragon turned around and walked away, and Julian stood there holding his sealed document while something in him quietly died. He asked, low, whether the voice of an untried and unworthy man was simply not worth a dragon's ear. "You are trying to talk to it," Amelia told him. "Stop talking. They do not hear words. They hear what you actually feel, clear and simple, a plain picture in your head. Hand it a tangle of ceremony and it hears nothing at all." Then Wilma Nielsen stepped up and proved her right. Wilma was tall and ranch-raised, red hair in a ponytail, the fastest rider in the cavalry, and the sort who had never in her life met an animal she was afraid of. She did exactly what Amelia said. She held one clear, uncomplicated want in her mind, offered her stones, and swung up onto a green-feathered running dragon's back, and the dragon let her. Then it ran. It went from a walk to a gale, and Wilma rode it thundering the whole length of the plateau, whooping into the wind, laughing wild, shouting back that she loved it, that this was a magnificent creature. The soldiers roared. The first human being had properly ridden a dragon under Amelia's method. The army everyone kept talking about stopped being a theory in that one long, thundering minute and started being a fact. One by one, the other soldiers shook off their fear and rode too. Only Julian could not manage it. Too intense, too knotted up, too busy trying to negotiate with a creature that wanted feeling and not paperwork. He consoled himself the only way he knew how, filling a notebook with grim, exact observations. The precise angle at which to pat a dragon, roughly 48 degrees from below, at something under a tenth of his full strength. Amelia offered kindly to coach him. She also told him he was hopeless with animals. Both were true. Home again, riding high on the whole expedition, Amelia went straight to Cedric and asked for something extravagant. If he truly wanted to thank her, she said, he could outfit her a proper dragon research lab, the expensive kind, with the sealed protective magic tools the finest facilities used, the ones that let no scrap of contamination escape. She meant, she added, grinning, to study dragon droppings. Julian made a strangled noise. He demanded to know what she wanted with anything so costly, then decided the real problem was whatever she was hiding, and tried to go inspect her private room for it. Amelia headed him off in the corridor. He pressed. She warned him, sweetly, that if he did not back off, she would tell the entire march he had been caught stealing her underthings, and she would make it a very good story. He reeled. They were still going at it, insult for insult, when Cedric raised his voice over the pair of them. He said their friendship was charming and all, but they had better hear him out first. Then he produced a letter, and the whole silly quarrel drained out of the room. The Empress had summoned Amelia to the Imperial Palace. Julian said flatly that this had to be a joke. It was not. A commoner researcher with no family on any record, a girl who had washed up on the deadliest shore in the world 7 years ago and had never once wanted to be seen, was being called to the capital by the single most powerful woman in the Empire, and nobody in that warm lamplit room could say why. Amelia turned the letter over in her hands. The seal was real. Somewhere at the end of it was a throne, and a question, and a great many people who had spent 7 years believing a certain girl was safely dead. She did not know the half of what waited for her there. She only knew the summons was real, and that a life she had finally, carefully built was about to be pulled loose from the frontier and carried straight toward the center of everything. She did not know either that one kingdom away, the people who had thrown her onto the dragons still believed they had won. 4 dragons hit the plains road at a dead run, and the world went to blur. They ran on 6 legs each, cloud pale and long-strided, and the road under them was one that swallowed stagecoaches for 7 days at a stretch. The dragons meant to cross it before dark. Amelia lay low over the neck of hers, reins loose in her fists, and she was not steering with them. There was no bit in the dragon's mouth, no headstall, nothing to haul on. The new saddle gave her stirrups and reins for her own balance, and nothing more. The dragon took its heading from the picture she held steady in her mind, a clean line east and a wish to eat the miles, and it ran where the picture pointed. This was the bargain. Summoned to the imperial capital to stand in front of the Empress, Amelia had fought it tooth and claw, because a month lost to bows and curtsies was a month stolen from her dragons. So Cedric had turned the summons into fieldwork. He had commissioned her, plainly, to ride one of the 6-legged cloud dragons the whole way and report on how a small squad might travel mounted. A dreaded audience had become an experiment, and that she could stomach. Beside her, Wilma Nielsen rode with her red ponytail streaming and a whoop torn straight out of her chest, drunk on the speed. On Amelia's other side, Julian rode grimly upright, and he had earned the right to. He had camped out on the peninsula for days to win his mount's trust, and it had cost him. Now he kept his seat, said nothing, and let the wind do the talking. They crossed a 7-day road in under a day. The dragons could run further than the people on them could bear, so the party dropped into a scrub hollow off the road to let their bodies recover, and it was there, in the low gold light, that Julian told her the thing he had carried the whole way. He had a half-sister, the 4th princess, a girl named Tia, young and gravely ill, wasting under a sickness the court physicians could not name and could not slow. That alone would have been enough, but it was worse than illness. Someone had been breaking into her rooms. More than once, in the thick of the faction war grinding through the palace, men had gotten past her guards, and a sick child had become a piece on somebody's board. He did not push. He asked carefully whether Amelia might sometimes keep the girl company. Nothing more than that. Not a physician, not a bodyguard, a companion. He said it in the voice of a man who had learned not to ask for much. Amelia understood exactly why he was asking her, of all people. Every other soul near that princess wanted something, rank or favor, or a rung up the ladder. Amelia wanted a research budget and to be left alone with her dragons. She was the one adult in his whole tangled court who would look at a dying princess and see a person instead of a lever. "I'll talk with her," Amelia said. "I'm no doctor, but I can sit with a kid." That earned a breath of something like relief out of him. Then he told her the harder thing. The ship that had exploded under him and thrown him half drowned onto her shore had not been an accident. Neither had the fire at Kirid, the one that fed on the roots and ate every water spell they threw at it. Both had been examined. Both were deliberate. Someone with reach and patience was moving against his line, and had been for a while, and the 2 disasters Amelia had pulled him and a whole village out of were the opening moves of a quieter war. Julian was a prince of common blood, mocked at court for his mother, raised by the Empress out of a charity nobody let him forget. He knew what it was to be a target. He looked at Amelia in the failing light and told her, without ceremony, that whatever the capital threw at her, he meant to stand between her and it. She had saved him twice. He meant to be worth it. Amelia, who had spent 7 years being nobody's business, filed it away and did not argue. Hellsheim swallowed them whole. The imperial capital was not a city so much as a country folded into a valley. The royal palace and the government ministries, the research institutes and the workshops, the army garrison and the great national academy, all crammed shoulder to shoulder and pulling people in from every corner of the empire. Amelia had lived 7 years on a wild frontier with dragons for neighbors, and the sheer press of human beings hit her like weather. She told Julian she felt she might be swept off her feet and carried away by the current of it, and she half meant it. Julian steered her through the worst of the crowds. He was wearing plain glasses now, cheap and round, and when she asked, he admitted flatly that they were a disguise. A prince walking the open streets drew knives dressed as smiles, and it was easier to be nobody. He warned her, too, to keep clear of the districts out by the walls, where organizations the crown did not control ran their own law, and even ordinary citizens walked wide. The crowd did something strange to her. In the crush and the noise, a memory surfaced that did not belong to this life at all. A different crowd and a different station, a press of strangers under hard flat light, and a sick girl at the end of it in a white bed who had died wanting only to touch something alive. It rose and passed. She let it. She had 2 lives worth of being overlooked, and only one of them had dragons in it. Then something ordinary happened, which was almost funny after all that. At a skewer stall, where Julian handed her coin to buy food for Wilma and the others, the shopkeeper looked the 2 of them over and teased that they made a fine couple. When they both denied it too fast, he laughed and guessed brother and sister instead, and they denied that too, and stood there flustered, a prince and a dragon researcher squabbling over a stick of grilled meat. The tailor came after. They would not put her in a court gown. Since that was a costume for a lie, nobody bothered telling, so they fitted her instead for a white scholar's robe coat, the empire's formal dress for a commoner of learning. She stood still for the measuring and admitted, half to herself, that she had not worn anything new in over 7 years. Everything she owned had been washed thin in rivers, torn by claws, and burned for firewood. The new coat was clean and stiff and correct, and putting it on felt like putting on somebody else. Days later, they brought her to Nordret Palace in the white coat, and she felt like a thief the whole way there. They waited in a reception room, built to make a person feel like a smudge. Gold afternoon light lay across the marble in long, clean panels, and the hush was the expensive kind, thick as felt, the sort of quiet that costs a great deal of money to keep. Amelia stood in it in her stiff white coat and counted the doors and the guards out of old habit, the way a person does who has learned that rooms have exits and that it pays to know them. Then the far doors opened and the woman came through. She did not look like the most powerful woman in the empire, which was precisely how Amelia knew to watch her. Fiona, the empress consort, wore her authority the way other women wore perfume, lightly and everywhere and impossible to wash off. She looked a full decade younger than she had any right to. She greeted Julian first with a warmth that was formal and real at once. She had raised him, common blood and all, and it showed in the way her eyes went over him. Then she turned to Amelia and thanked her, sincerely and at length, for pulling her son out of the sea, for putting out the carriage fire when every mage on the border had failed. Amelia, who was allergic to gratitude, muttered something about the dragons having done the actual work, and waited for the rest of it, because there was always a rest of it. It came without a change in her tone. In the same even voice she had used to thank her, Fiona said she knew who Amelia was. Not the nameless commoner researcher from the Walkure March, Amelia Reeves, daughter of Count Cain Reeves, of the Kingdom of Elmenia. The room went very quiet. Amelia did not move. 7 years buried, and a stranger had just set her old name down on the marble between them, like a card turned face up. Beside her, Julian had gone still in a way that told her he had known this was coming, or half of it, and had said nothing to spare her the waiting. Fiona watched her take it. Then she said there was one thing she wished to ask, one direct question, and she let the question hang there, unspoken, a blade balanced on its point. Fiona let the silence sit a moment, then lifted one hand, and every attendant along the walls filed out and drew the doors shut behind them. The great room emptied of everyone who did not need to hear this. When the last latch clicked, she began to speak, and she did not hurry. The Empire, she said, did not hand its army to a stranger without learning her first, so they had learned Amelia. They had started with a death that did not sit right. A noble girl of Elmenia, gone 7 years ago, mourned and buried with no body to bury. They had traced the gap in the story. They had followed it across a border and a ritual and a lie, and they had kept following until there was nothing left to doubt. Somewhere far off in the palace, a clock kept its time. In the emptied hall, Fiona's voice did not echo. The great room simply swallowed each word and held it, and there was nowhere for any of it to go. And then she said the thing out loud. Amelia had not been exiled for any crime. Amelia had been sent to the Dragon Peninsula to die in another girl's place. Elmenia had dressed it up as the rite of cleansing, an old and holy word for what was plainly an execution. And under that word, they had shipped a 17-year-old out to the deadliest shore on any map. Not to cleanse her of anything, to be a body in a princess's grave, so that the princess could stand up unharmed and be crowned the saint who had survived the trial. A trial she had never once set foot near. Someone had to die out there for the miracle to be real. Amelia was the someone. Carmilla was the miracle. Fiona said it plainly and did not soften it and did not look away while she said it. Amelia was the one they had thrown away, not the saint. The saint was the lie, and Amelia was the truth it had been built on top of. And here was the strange thing. For 7 years, Amelia had known all of it. She had known it on the boat, under the veil, listening to the bolt slide home. She had known it every single day since, the way you know an old scar is there without having to touch it. But knowing a thing alone, inside your own skull, was one thing. Hearing another mouth shape it, hearing a queen of a foreign empire lay it out in a quiet room as simple fact was something else entirely. It was the difference between a thing that merely happened to you and a thing that is true out loud in the world, where others can hear it. For one long moment, Amelia could not have spoken if she had tried. The truth had been let out of her and set down on the table between them, and it did not belong only to her anymore. She did not weep. She had done her weeping years ago on a shore with a baby dragon in her arms. She only breathed and let it be said. What sat oddly in her chest was not grief, and not even the old anger. It was that someone had finally bothered to check. For 7 years, the whole clean arrangement had rested on nobody caring enough to count the bodies, on a family so certain of her worthlessness that they had not troubled to hide the seam in the story. They had thrown her out like something spoiled, and never once looked back to see if it landed. And here, across a border, sat a stranger who had cared enough to pull the loose thread, not out of any love, but simply because Amelia had grown into a thing worth investigating. Even that, she thought, was more than the people who bore her had ever once offered her. Fiona was not finished. There was one more piece, and she gave it as plainly as the rest. The princess who had been crowned for surviving Amelia's death, Carmilla, had once raised her hand against the empire's own fourth princess, against Tia. The sick girl in the palace and the false saint 1 kingdom away were bound to the same lie by the same cruel hand. Fiona let that land, and she watched Amelia's face the whole time it did. The light failed while they sat there, and servants came to light the lamps and went away again, and Fiona asked her questions. She asked first whether any loyalty was left in Amelia for the Reeves family, or for Elmenia, or for the crown that had signed her away. She did not ask it gently. Underneath it, Amelia could hear the shape of the real offer, the one queens make without ever quite making it. The Empire knew the whole fraud now. The Empire had reach. A word from a woman in this room could pull Elmenia's court apart at the seams, could drag the truth into the light, and let it burn the count and the crown and the borrowed halo down to the foundations. All of it was on the table. All Amelia had to do was want it. Amelia said she had no loyalty left to Elmenia and no wish to ever go back. If anyone tried to haul her out of the Empire and back to that court, she said, she would simply go and live on the Dragon Peninsula with the dragons, where nobody had ever once tried to make her curtsy. Then Fiona asked the other question, whether Amelia wanted revenge. And this was the fork the whole story had been walking toward. The people who had thrown her to the dragons were within reach at last, named and provable, and a queen was all but holding out the knife. Amelia thought about it. She actually thought about it, which was somehow both worse and better than a flinch. Then she told the truth. I only want my dragons, she said. She said it plainly, the way you state the weather. She had a life. She had a sea dragon the size of an island out in the deep water, and the small ones tucked warm in her cloak, and a whole peninsula of them she was only beginning to understand. She had her research, her costly protective tools, her lab. She had Julian arguing with her the length of a corridor, and Wilma thundering across a plateau on the first dragon anyone had ever properly ridden. She had Cedric's dry patronage, and a town that could not decide what to call her. That was hers. And she had built the whole of it out of the exact thing they had done to her. because, and she said this too, without heat, being thrown away was what had given her the dragons. If her mother had never locked her in that windowless carriage, she would have lived and died an old noblewoman who never once touched a thing that could kill her and chose not to. They had meant to end her. Instead, they had handed her the only life she had ever wanted. By her own strange arithmetic, it had turned out well. To take her revenge, she would have to walk back into their story and pick up the part of the wronged girl and play it out to the end on their stage. She would still be reacting to them. She would still, in some way, be theirs. And she was finished being theirs. There was a version of her that would have taken the knife. The girl in the carriage would have taken it without a blink. But even that girl, under the veil, had wanted one thing more than she wanted them punished. And it was not an apology. And it was not their ruin. It was to never again be a piece that someone else reached out and moved. Revenge was only one more way of being moved. One last errand run at their expense, on a board they still owned. She would not pick up the piece. Refusing them the fight was the one move they could neither survive nor answer, because it left them clutching a lie with no one left who cared enough to knock it down. So the debt did not close. Nobody paid. The count still sat in his hall. The false saint still wore her stolen sainthood, and Amelia let them, for now, and turned her back on all of it to go and talk about dragons. Fiona studied her for a long moment, and whatever she had braced for, this plainly was not it. A grasping girl she could have used and mistrusted. A vengeful one she could have aimed and feared. This one wanted nothing the Empire could not cheaply give, and would never be a knife in anyone's hand. The Empress Consort decided on the spot that she liked her odds, so she made her own offer, the real one. From here on, Amelia would be known simply as Amelia, a commoner of the Empire, with no Reeves in it anywhere. And Fiona would put the weight of the First Prince faction behind the dragon research, protection, funding, a place in the Empire that Elmenia could not reach into. A queen had named the fraud, and instead of a weapon, she had chosen to build a wall. Amelia, offered the throne's protection, mostly wanted to know whether it came with a bigger budget. There was one more thing Fiona wanted, and it pretended not to be political at all. She arranged for Amelia to meet the fourth princess that very evening. Julian bowed to his mother's orders and said quietly that he would look after Amelia himself. This time, it was not a soldier making a report. It was a promise between the two of them, made in front of the woman who had raised him. They brought her to a curtained room deep in the palace, where the air was warm and still and thick with the smell of medicine. The girl in the bed was younger than Amelia had braced for. Tia was thin in the way that frightens you, her skin gone pale and papery, her hair dull against the pillow, some sickness eating at her from the inside that no physician in the Empire had been able to name or slow. And yet, she pushed herself up when they came in and greeted Amelia with a grace so practiced it caught in the throat and made light of how she felt, the way children do when they have already learned that their pain is a burden on the grown people around them. Amelia had no court manners and did not reach for any. She did not bow to the rank or flinch at the sickness. She sat down beside the bed the way she would have sat beside anyone, and she talked to the girl about dragons, about a sea dragon as big as an island and a lightning one small enough to ride in a pocket. And she watched the princess forget for a few minutes to be brave. She did not yet know how she would help. She only knew, sitting there, that she was not going to let this one go the way she herself had once been let go. So the truth was finally out. A queen of the Empire knew the whole of it now, that Amelia was the girl they had thrown to the dragons, and that the Saint of Elmenia was a lie standing on her supposed grave. But knowing was not paying. No count had been called to account. No borrowed halo knocked crooked. The fraud had only been spoken aloud in one quiet room and then set carefully aside because the woman it had been done to would rather study dragons than settle scores. She had a queen at her back now, a name scrubbed clean, and a wall between her and the people who had sold her. She had a dying girl to sit with and a clock she could not yet hear ticking. And one kingdom away, the family that had signed her away and the princess wearing her sainthood still slept easy, still certain the girl on the peninsula was 7 years dead, not knowing that the truth had a witness now and a throne, and all the time in the world to wait. The palace was so large that walking to a sick girl's room counted as exercise. Amelia had crossed most of a wing already, past doors taller than the houses she grew up near, and she'd announced to no one in particular, nobody needs a hallway you could race dragons down. Julian, keeping pace beside her, did not laugh. He stopped instead, halfway to his sister's room, and asked her the thing he had plainly been carrying the whole way. He wanted to know if it was truly so, that being thrown out by her own family, by the whole kingdom that raised her, left her feeling nothing at all. Amelia thought about it the way a person thinks about weather. She told him she had made her peace years ago, and that she was even grateful because the same carriage her mother had locked was the one that carried her to the dragons. She would not trade the dragons back for a family that had never wanted her. Julian's ears went red. He said quickly that his concern was only for law and order, that a thing like that ought not go unpunished on principle, and the harder he insisted it was principle, the plainer it became that he was furious on her behalf and did not know where to put it. She let him keep his excuse. It was a kinder one than most people had ever bothered to offer her. Then, a few doors from the girl's room, her magic sense pricked. The air ahead sat thick with magic, denser than any room should hold, pooling like heat before a storm. Julian saw her go still and explained it under his breath. His half-sister had been born making more magic than her body could safely carry, and it had been wearing her down since the day she first drew breath. Inside, the fourth princess lay small in an enormous canopied bed, maids stationed at its corners like furniture. She was pale as paper and thinner than the last time, and she gathered herself up to greet them with a courtesy that clearly cost her something. She thanked Amelia again for pulling her brother out of the sea and for putting out the fire at Carriage, and she apologized twice for being so much trouble to everyone. Amelia had heard that apology before, in another life, out of her own mouth. She waved it off and sat down without being asked. Julian stayed on his feet. He told his sister, gently, that he meant to move her out of the capital, to Walcure, where the walls were thick and far from the knives of the court. There had been intruders again. Everyone in the room knew it, and no one said it. Tia agreed at once, the way she agreed to everything. But Amelia watched her swallow something first, a thought she folded down and did not speak. Some fear or wish she had learned long ago to keep behind her teeth. Amelia knew that swallow. She had done it in a hospital bed a whole life ago, small and sick, and certain she was a weight on people who would be lighter without her. Looking at the girl in the great bed, she felt a kinship she had not gone looking for and did not much want and could not put down. Whatever else happened, she decided, she was not going to let this one be quietly set aside the way she herself had been set aside. A kingdom to the west, in a colder house, a rumor would not die. It came to Count Cain Reeves the way rot comes to a beam, quietly, from underneath, long before anything shows on the surface. The girl thrown to the Dragon Peninsula 7 years ago, the one whose death had cleaned a princess's name and hung a halo on her head. She was being spoken of now in market corners and courier reports, as though she had never died at all. Worse, spoken of in the same breath as the Albaran Empire, and its soldiers, and the dragons that were said to ride with them. He sat very still while the candle burned down, and behind the Count's careful face, the arithmetic ran cold and fast. If the scapegoat lived, then the saint had survived nothing. If the scapegoat was ever recognized, the lie he had signed his name to would open like a wound, and everything the Reeves name had climbed on top of would come down with it. He did not think of a daughter. He had stopped thinking of her as one the day he sent her out. He thought of a loose thread with his family's whole weight hanging off it, and of how loose threads were dealt with. He told himself, the way men like him always do, that this was about protecting the family. He half believed it. That was the part that let him sleep. Moving a princess in secret turned out to be a matter of dragons wearing horses' faces. Once Tia had steadied enough to travel, they carried her home to Walcure behind a team of 6-legged cloud dragons, 3 of them harnessed to the great imperial carriage and wrapped in illusion so that anyone on the road saw only a fine team of gray horses. They went at a walk on purpose. Amelia and Wilma had already learned, the hard way, that a carriage pushed to full dragon speed simply came apart, wheels first and then everything, and both of them had been thrown clear more than once, finding that out. So the dragons ambled, tireless, and no one had to stop. Amelia rode alongside on Sigurd, her wind dragon with the old scar down one hind leg. The small lightning dragon, Zeke, curled asleep on her shoulder. She felt the girl watching her through the carriage window before she heard her. Tia had been told, her whole sheltered life, that dragons were man-eating monsters. Now one paced along beside her carriage in the afternoon light, graceful and enormous, and utterly calm, and she asked in a small voice whether she might touch it. Amelia brought Sigurd close and let her. The princess reached out from the window and laid her thin hand flat on warm green plumage, and her whole face changed. The creature was softer and gentler than any nightmare had ever promised. Then Amelia started explaining dragon anatomy, cheerfully and in far too much detail. And when she reached the part about dragons living on ambient magic and passing no waste at all, Julian cut in sharply that this was not fit talk for his sister. Tia laughed. It came out of her by surprise, bright and unguarded, the first real laugh any of them had heard from her. And Julian, caught mid-scold, looked like a man who had just been handed something he had given up on. In Elmenia, the rumor became a report. Confirmation reached Kane Reeves in the plain language of people paid to be certain. The discarded girl was alive. She was inside the Albaran Empire, and the Empire's soldiers were being taught to ride dragons by a woman who fit her description exactly. He read it once and did not read it twice. He did not rage. Men who sign their own children away rarely do. It is a quiet kind of cold that lets you do the thing in the first place. He simply began, that night, to work the problem the only two ways it could be worked. Either the girl was brought back under Elmenian law, where a family could put a name and a leash on her again, or she was made permanently, dependably silent. He weighed the two the way another man might weigh a debt, and started, patiently, to move. None of it reached the road, where a sick girl was laughing at dragons in the gold of the afternoon. That was the shape of the whole thing. Warmth built in the light, a knife sharpened in the dark, and an entire country lying between them for now. They reached Walkure after several days on the road. Tia's illness flared once, badly, in the last stretch before the gates, stress pulling at her the way it always did. But a bed and a physician steadied her by nightfall, and the worst of it passed. A few mornings later, Amelia stood in Cedric's study and handed the Margrave a written account of everything the Cloud Dragons had shown on the journey. He read it through with Julian at his shoulder. The three of them turned it over. The dragons were extraordinary, faster than any horse, tireless for days, powerful enough to matter in a war. But the problems were just as real. Carriages too fragile for the pace. Riders whose eyes dried and streamed in the wind. Cedric suggested that wind magic might hold a still pocket of air around a rider's face. Amelia admitted the glass shield she had pictured was beyond anything this world could grind. Julian, for his part, thanked her, properly, without his usual bluster, for keeping his sister occupied the whole way. The girl had held steadier on that road than she had in months, and he had noticed exactly why. A few days after that, Amelia came to Tia's room with Zeke tucked in the crook of her arm and a job in her pocket. "I need someone to watch this one for me," she said, setting the little dragon down on the coverlet. "Note what he does, when he sleeps, what he wants." She was going to be busy with the soldiers and the drills, she explained, and she needed the observations written down for her research. She had already cleared it with Cedric, with Julian, with the physician. All Tia had to do was say yes. A maid started to object that the princess must not tire herself. Tia did not hear her. Something had come up in the girl's face that had not been there in a very long time. Not gratitude, which she handed out too freely, but hunger. She said she did not know whether she could do it well, only that she would try with everything she had. Then she gathered the little dragon carefully against her chest and would not let the maid take him away. Amelia watched it land and let herself feel it. She knew this exactly. She had spent a whole life in a bed, being carried and fed and spared and pitied, being a thing that was done to, and what had hollowed her out was never the sickness so much as the uselessness, the long empty days with nothing to do but be a burden and wait. No one had ever thought to hand that girl a reason to sit up, so Amelia had handed her one, a small warm creature that needed her, a task that was hers alone, and the plain, enormous dignity of being asked. For the length of that afternoon, the fourth princess was not a patient. She was a researcher with an assignment and a dragon on her lap, and she sat up straighter than her illness should have allowed. It was not medicine. Amelia knew that even as she watched it work, but it was the first thing in years that had made the girl want to get better instead of only endure, and sometimes that was where a cure had to start. The therapy worked in the sick room. Out on the training field, something else was working. The Cloud Dragons had folded into the Walkure soldiers' morning drills as though they had always belonged there, most of the men warming to them by the day, only a few of the older ones still keeping a careful distance. Amelia liked to watch the rides. What she liked most was watching Wilma. On the ground, Wilma Nielsen was blunt and steady, a soldier like any other. In the saddle, at speed, she came apart into pure joy. She took her dragon over the field at a full run, clearing every obstacle, whooping and laughing out loud, urging the beast to go faster and then faster still. Julian, beside Amelia, explained it dryly. Wilma was a famous speedster, recruited to Walkure for exactly this, and that howling delight was simply what she turned into when the world blurred past. Amelia thought the first true dragon rider the world had ever seen could not have picked a better face to wear. The physician found them at the rail as the ride wound down. Theodore was a careful man, courteous, an expert in magic-born illness, and he was plainly a little unsettled. He reported that Tia had stabilized, genuinely, measurably, since the small dragon began keeping her company. It was the first time in all his long care of her that he had seen the girl so lively, and he wanted to know how Amelia had known it would help. She told him most of the truth. In another place, once, she had seen sick people handed animals to hold, and watched them get better for it in ways no chart could quite explain. Julian scolded her for having left the dragon with Tia before the physician had even signed off on it, and then admitted, more quietly, that he had spent so long trying not to overtax his sister that it had never once occurred to him to give her something to do. Then, the three of them said the hard part plainly. The company steadied Tia. It did not touch the disease. The dragon could sit with her, but it could not draw the excess magic out of her body. Dragons fed on the magic loose in air and water, and could not pull it from a living thing. And until something drained that flood at its source, the illness would keep wearing her down. A gentler comfort had a ceiling. They had just found it. Amelia stood at the rail and turned that over. She had spent a past life wishing for a cure that never came, and she was not built to sit at a ceiling. There was, she thought, another way, a far more dangerous one, aimed straight at the source instead of the symptom. She did not say it aloud yet. She only started, quietly, to plan it. The way certain people a kingdom away were quietly planning things of their own. For weeks, Amelia had been building a cure in her head and telling no one. Now she was building it with her hands, and the first piece of it lived in the deadliest strip of land she knew. She rode Triton in low over the water, the great sea dragon carrying her past the military port and out to where the peninsula turned savage, the belt of scoured rock, where dragons and monsters tore at each other, and no human kept a house. Walkure had given her scent tools that turned the monsters' noses away. Everything else she had to earn on foot. She spent days out there. She came back across Triton's back with a fresh trove of observation notes and an old head wound reopened, and she counted the trade more than fair. The data she had gone in for was the one piece her whole plan had been missing, the mana ecology of a certain kind of dragon, the thing that might reach the root of a dying girl's illness instead of just its symptoms. She patted the sea dragon's flank when he set her down, and he cried out, pleased, the way he always did now that he had widened his whole range just to keep nearer to her. None of it stayed secret for long. Her 7 years of study were being bound into a proper book under the Empire's own history office. Her name printed into a record no one could ever politely pretend away. The words Dragon Doctor had begun to travel past Walcure's borders on their own, and far to the west, in the kingdom that had shipped her off to die, those words were landing like a stone dropped into still water. A rumor that the girl said to have perished on the peninsula was alive, and commanding dragons for the rival empire. She did not yet know how hard that rumor was traveling. She only knew she had her data, and she meant to spend it fast. She was still cataloging the trip in her head when she nearly walked straight into Julian in the corridor, and both of them stopped at the same instant, because both of them were wrapped in gauze. His head and one arm were bandaged. Hers were worse. Each looked the other over and arrived at the same silent verdict, that the other had been doing something reckless and would not say what. Infirmary. Now, when she started to argue that the data came first, Julian simply picked her up and carried her there himself, bandaged arm and all, a servant trailing behind with her gear. The infirmary doctor was out, so he sat her on a cot and dressed her wounds with his own hands. Quick and practiced, the movements of a man who had learned first aid somewhere. Blood was involved. He told her, not gently, to stop leaning on healing magic when clean gauze did the job better, which was exactly why her old head wound had torn open again. Twice she asked what had happened to him. Both times he steered around it and gave her nothing. She filed the evasion away with the rest of the day's data and let it sit. Whatever he was bleeding for, he did not want it named yet. He threatened, half serious, to tie her to the cot if she stood before she was properly seen to, then went to find the doctor. She stayed put, already sorting the notes in her head, already deciding who needed to see them, the Margrave and old Theodore. Because the trove in her bag was not really about wild dragons at all. It was the missing piece of a girl's cure. She had meant to file the data with Cedric first, but the Margrave was gone, away for hours down at Port Haven, where a ship of no honest nationality had run aground on the coast, flying no flag anyone could name. Amelia noted the wreck the way she noted anything wrong, set it aside, and took her findings to Theodore instead. The old doctor had been chewing on the animal company idea she had handed him weeks before, and he confirmed for her the exact shape of the princess's illness. Using magic risked the seizures. Governing the flow of mana inside her own body was simply impossible. That was the part no medicine could touch. But converting mana from one attribute to another still worked. A girl who could not control the magic drowning her could still, with her own hands, make a stone out of it. Then Amelia laid the peninsula data on the desk and walked him through the mana ecology she had nearly died to record, and watched the old man go quiet, then pale, as he understood where it pointed. "You are telling me," he began, and could not finish. "I'm telling you there might be a way to the root," she said. "Not the symptom, the root." He looked at the pages for a long time and did not touch his coffee. At Tia's tea the next day, Amelia drank the whole cup down in one swallow and caught a cookie out of the air with her mouth, scandalizing the servants and earning, in memory, Julian's remembered verdict that she was vulgar. Tia only laughed until she had to wipe her eyes. Amelia told her stories of surviving alone on the peninsula, and the sick girl listened with a longing so open it hurt to watch. Not the grasping envy Amelia remembered from another life, the kind that wanted to strip away what someone else had. Tia only wanted to be free. She wanted, and then apologized for wanting, and called herself a burden for it in the same breath. So Amelia pushed. "If you are afraid of being scolded," she told her, "get someone's permission and then go do the thing anyway. A little trouble is allowed." She wore her wild rudeness on purpose, holding it out to the girl like an open door. "Ride a dragon, just once. Use your rank to make it safe instead of shrinking behind it." Tia lit up like a child. Permission was arranged through Cedric and Julian. A gentle walking ride, nothing more, on a calm day. On the appointed day, the princess woke too ill to stand. The ride collapsed into quiet, and the illness went back to keeping its own schedule, taking from her every good day it could reach. The next attack was worse. Tia lay feverish and short of breath, and when Amelia and Julian reached her, she did nothing but apologize. For the ruined ride, for the trouble, for being, she said, a burden to everyone, and most of all, to her mother, the Empress. She dragged the blanket up over her face and cried under it. Julian tried to comfort her, and failed completely. Amelia ran out of patience with the gloom. She pulled the blanket back, dropped a cold wet towel squarely on the girl's forehead, and told her flatly to stop drowning the whole room in it, because she had research to do and could not think through all that fog. Julian flared at her. Tia went still with shock, her tears stopping mid-breath. Then Amelia sent for Cedric and Theodore, and when the four of them had gathered, she laid the cure on the table. There was a kind of fire dragon out on the peninsula, she told them. A long, limbless, serpent-bodied thing with heavy jaws and horns that did not feed on stones like the others. It fed by drawing mana straight out of living creatures through its own skin, and it usually left them alive afterward to make more. A dragon like that could pull off the very excess Tia's body could not hold. The sickness and the answer, it turned out, were the same substance. She had already found one, she said, and spent days in the field paying it high-purity fire mana until it tolerated her hands. But it had refused to follow her home to Walcure. It did not trust a promise from a human who would not be there every single day to keep it. And Amelia's own mana reserves were far too small for her to ever be that human. The logic closed like a trap, and everyone in the room heard it shut. Julian demanded whether she had lost her mind. Tia was a patient and a princess, not a field assistant. Cedric was grave, but the truth did not bend. The one person who could feed that dragon daily, the only provider it would ever accept, was the one girl whose illness had spared her exactly the power to make the stones. Tia would have to go to the Dragon Peninsula herself, stand in front of a wild dragon, and win it over in person. For a long moment, the sick girl only stared at nothing. Then something moved behind her eyes that none of them had seen there before. "I want to go," Tia said. "To the peninsula. I want to go." Tia held to her choice, and it steadied everyone around her the way her fear never had. Cedric worried aloud over her health, then, moved by the new set of her jaw, gave his blessing and told them to see it done. Julian brought out his secret. It was a carriage, a coach lifted on floating magic so it slid without friction, steady even at speed, the kind of thing that could carry a fragile girl fast and gentle across brutal country. He had been testing it in secret for weeks. That, at last, was where his bandages had come from. He had bled quietly, over and over, so his sister could ride safe, because he had spent his whole life feeling useless at her bedside and refused to feel it one day longer. If she had finally found the will to stand, he told her, he would throw his whole strength behind her back. They kept the party as small as it could be. Amelia, Julian, Tia, and Sigurd, the green running dragon harnessed to draw the floating coach, because excited dragons feed one another's fighting spirit, and a crowd would only pull monsters down on them. Tia climbed into the carriage bundled in wool against the cold silver blonde and thin, and, for once, wide awake with something other than fever. They went east and then out, into the wild. Tia watched the wild country unspool past the carriage window with her whole face open, drinking in an outside world she had been told. Her entire life was only a place to die. It was the first light she had ever been allowed to see, she said, so quietly it was almost to herself. Then Amelia, riding the coach roof as lookout, spotted the flame dragon. It was the one she had conditioned, but it was not the wary, tolerant creature she had left behind. It had just killed a monster, and it was still thrashing, whipping its long body against the rock past all reason. She looked harder and found the cause, a stick driven deep into one of its nostrils, jammed so far in that every breath was agony. The pain had burned the mind clean out of it. Something about how deep that stick sat pricked at her, the same wrong note as an unflagged wreck run aground on a quiet coast. She set the thought aside. There was no time for it now. The dragon fixed on the carriage and charged, faster than anything that size had any right to move. Sigurd's own blood came up hot in answer, until Amelia reached down through the horn link and steadied him. Whatever happened next, she thought, the creature had to live. Kill it, and the cure died with it. Fall back, she told Tia. I'll find a way to calm it. I always do. Julian was already moving to the front. He would take the worst of it, draw the thing's rage onto himself and off the carriage, and he would not be argued out of it, bandages or no. Amelia called the dragon's patterns out fast and flat, so each of them knew what was coming. Coil, tail sweep, bite, charge, and the wide fan of breath. Then Julian threw himself into the worst of it. He moved at a speed no ordinary man owned, body enhancement magic driving his legs, and he turned raw killing intent full onto the dragon, which felt malice the way skin feels heat. Its rage swung off the carriage and locked onto him. It opened its jaws and loosed a spreading sheet of fire, and Julian drew a sword whose blade extended in a long edge of blue-white light and cut the wall of flame apart, stepping cleanly through the seam of it. Under the cover he bought her, Amelia ran to the dragon's flank and started to climb. She had a spell for clinging to sheer rock on mountain surveys, and she used it now to stick fast to a thrashing giant, a torn branch clenched in her teeth, hauling herself up its heaving side hand over hand, while it bucked and rolled to throw her off. She reached the head. She spun a rope of light from the branch to the buried stick, cinched it tight, and hurled the branch clear, and in the same motion, the dragon flung her from its back. She fell hard, hit the ground rolling, and held the spell whole through all of it, bruised, breathless, still gripping her thread of light like a fisherman with a line. The branch flew towards Sigurd, and on Sigurd's back, riding a dragon for the first time in her life, sat Tia, who had been told to run and had chosen instead to stay. She caught the branch. She gave the command down the horn link, and Sigurd surged forward with the force of a loose train and tore the stick straight out of the dragon's nostril. The frenzy broke all at once. The long body went slack and still, the agony simply gone out of it, and the three of them had done together what no soldier at Walkure could have managed alone. Amelia sat up in the dust and looked at the stick lying free on the rock. Too deep, too deliberate, not the sort of thing a dragon ever did to itself. She tucked the unease away beside the wreck off Port Haven, and a quiet, growing certainty that some hand had been making this coast lethal on purpose. And then she turned to the only work that mattered today. The flame dragon lay calm now, spent and enormous. Nearly 10 meters of it stretched out along the cooling rock. Amelia's nose was bleeding from the fall. She pressed a corner of her white coat to it, healed herself in a breath, and stood. Julian rounded on her first, his scorched coat still smoking at the hem, furious that she had let his sister anywhere near that. But Tia stepped in front of the anger and answered it herself. It had been her own choice, she said, and she would make it again tomorrow. Julian's mouth worked and nothing came out. Then, gruff and half undone, he admitted it was Tia's part that had saved all of them, and thanked his little sister to her face. Amelia guided the dragon's attention around onto Tia. It was faster and surer, she explained, to let the girl speak to it directly than to drill the terms through by proxy. This bond had to be Tia's own, or it would be nothing. Then she stepped back and let a dying girl stand in front of a creature that ate magic. Tia spoke to it from the very bottom of her heart. I have been sick my whole life, she told the dragon, her voice thin but steady. I have watched everyone else run and ride and fly, and I have only ever watched them do it. I have wanted one thing. I want to move through the sky. If you will carry me there, I will feed you all the mana in my body every day for as long as I live. It is yours. Every bit of it is yours. And in the middle of the plea, the illness took her. The attack buckled her where she stood, the mana she could not govern turning on her body again. But this time, the dragon pressed its great head close and began to feed, drawing the wild excess out of her through its skin, the very surplus that had been poisoning her since the day she was born. Amelia watched the girl's face and forgot, for a moment, to be a scientist. The trembling eased, the gasping slowed and evened. The thing that had been killing Tia was pouring, harmlessly, into a creature that had been starving for precisely it. Sickness and cure were one substance, and Amelia had built the whole design of it across a season of nearly dying. And even she had not been wholly certain until this instant that it would truly hold. It held. It was holding right in front of her. The dragon lowered its head to the ground, plain as a spoken sentence, an invitation. Tia climbed onto the dragon's back, and then a girl who had never once been allowed outside her own sick room rose off the ground and up into open air, the great body gliding under her as gently as a pleasure boat over still water. She flew. She had never in her whole life done anything but watch other people do it, and now she was the one in the sky, and she wept, not from pain, for the first time in her memory, but because her body had never felt so light. She said it over and over, laughing through it. She could not even say how, only that it had never felt like this. Amelia stood in the dust and watched her go up, and something she kept locked came quietly open in her chest. She had died once, in another life, in a narrow white bed, wanting nothing at the end but to lay a hand on one living animal before she went. No one had brought her one. She had carried that small unmet wish down through death and into the whole of this second life. And here she was on the far side of it, handing a caged girl, not an animal, but an entire sky. The world had thrown Tia away as too sick to be worth keeping, the way it had once thrown Amelia to the dragons, as too worthless to keep it all. Two discarded girls on a savage coast. One of them had just handed the other everything she had ever been denied. Beside her, Julian was crying openly and would not admit a second of it. He scrubbed at his face and insisted, to no one in particular, that it was only the rain. It was not raining. There was not a single cloud in all that gold sky. Amelia opened her mouth to point this out, looked at the two of them instead, the brother wrecked, the sister soaring, and for once in her life decided to let a moment belong to someone else and keep her mouth shut. And the story traveled, the way stories do. A dragon doctor had tamed a rampaging flame dragon on the peninsula and cured an imperial princess of an illness the world had called a death sentence. Folded quietly inside that tale, unkillable now, went the older truth, that a real girl had once survived that same wilderness alone. The girl a Western kingdom had buried under a false saint's crown, so the wrong princess could be crowned holy in her place. It reached ears in the empire that could act on it. Far to the west, the lie strained under a weight it had never been built to carry, and the family that had signed her away felt the ground shift under them for the first time. None of it had come due yet. The crown still sat on the wrong head. No one had answered for anything. The old debt only leaned a little closer, but in a gold sky over a brutal coast, a dying girl was flying and laughing and alive. And the girl they had thrown away was the whole reason for it. That today was more than enough. The first thing the town of Aldbury knew of it was the shadow crossing the market square. A flame dragon nearly 10 meters long slid over the rooftops, ember red and coiling. No legs to it, only that long snake body pouring across the sky. People screamed. A cart overturned. Then the border soldiers stepped out into the square with their hands raised, calling for calm, because Cedric and Julian had spent the better part of a month teaching this town that a dragon overhead was not the end of the world. The panic broke and turned, the way weather turns, into open-mouthed staring, because there was a girl on the dragon's back. A month before, Tia had not been able to cross a room without stopping to breathe. Now she rode the thing bareheaded with her silver hair streaming, laughing down at a town that had never once expected to see her upright, let alone flying. The soldiers lowered their hands and, without quite meaning to, began to cheer. Inside, the report was less dramatic and a great deal more satisfying. Tia stood through the whole of it, unaided, which she had never done in her life. Theodore kept glancing at her, the way a man checks a miracle to be sure it has not wandered off. He explained the shape of it plainly. The princess's body still made more magic than it could safely hold. That had not changed, and never would, but the flame dragon drank the excess off through contact, and with the surplus gone, her symptoms had all but vanished. She would need a draining every day. Do that, and she could live an ordinary life. She could ride, she could run. She could, Theodore said, do things that would have killed her a season ago. Cedric heard it out, then thanked Amelia from the heart, and said her research had been the true cause of all of it. Amelia looked as though she had been handed a live coal. She said she had done it for herself, for the research, so the gloom would finally lift out of the house and she could get back to her dragons in peace. Nobody in the room believed her. Julian's eyes had gone bright and wet, and he was pretending very hard that they had not. Then Tia, warm and guileless, mentioned how much Amelia had taught her lately and cheerfully listed some of it, including several blunt facts of biology that a princess was not, by any reckoning, supposed to know. Julian rounded on Amelia. He wanted to know how she dared fill his sister's head with such filth, whether she was incapable of teaching anything clean. "I teach everything I know," Amelia said, already easing back toward the window. "Every living thing has clean parts and filthy parts. I do not hide either one." She got one leg over the sill before he caught her by the collar and hauled her back one-handed, and the homecoming dissolved into an undignified scuffle while Cedric sighed into his hand and Theodore studied the ceiling. It was the most normal the house had felt in years. Later, once Tia had gone to rest, Cedric laid a thing across his desk that changed the color of the room. It was the object Sigurd had torn from the flame dragon's snout out on the peninsula. The thing Amelia had called a stick and known, even then, was no stick. Cleaned of blood, it was plainly a spear, wooden shaft, worked metal head, a made thing, a weapon. Amelia said flatly that it was nothing of hers, that she had never so much as bartered for a fine metal spear, and Cedric nodded. He had never thought otherwise. There was more. A wrecked ship had washed up along the coast, most of it gone, what remained scored with great fang marks and burned black. Read together, the two told one story. Poachers had come to the peninsula on the rumor that dragons could be lured in with monocrystals and taken. They had found the flame dragon instead. Its fire had left the burns. One man had lived to confess, so the thing in the dragon's nose had a hand behind it after all. Somebody had put it there on purpose. Cedric had already decided what to do. He wanted small garrisons along the coast, docks and lighthouses, and watch posts, shaped up out of the ground by earth magic so as not to tear the ecosystem apart, sighted to catch anyone slipping in by sea. It would take careful surveys to know where a wall could stand without driving the dragons off. Amelia said she would run them. She was going to be mapping that coast anyway. Neither of them said the quiet part. The peninsula had been the safest place in the world for her because no human would go there. Now humans came on purpose, and somebody outside was picking at the edge of her life. A kingdom away, the same rumor arrived wearing a crown it had never earned. Carmilla had been called a saint for 7 years. She had never set foot on the peninsula, never braved anything at all. The truth was smaller and uglier than the legend. A spoiled girl at an international gathering had wanted a black-haired imperial prince, the way she had wanted everything her whole life, had shoved the small silver-haired princess who told her a brother was not a thing to be handed over, and had let the loyal noble house that served her solve it the way that house solved every problem, by offering up its own daughter to be shipped out to die on the peninsula in the princess's place. The girl had gone quiet-eyed to the boats. The kingdom declared her dead. The church, with the crown's blessing, declared Carmilla holy for surviving an exile she had merely watched another girl be sent to. That was the whole of the miracle. She had grown comfortable in it, and now word came up the roads from the empire that there was a dragon saint out there, working real wonders, commanding dragons, putting out fires, raising a dying princess up to fly, and that this saint was a young woman with calm, steady eyes. Carmilla did not know the name. She did not need it. The old sickness woke in her all the same, the one that had gnawed her in another life whenever a quieter sister did a thing well. The flat certainty that somewhere, a girl who deserved nothing was being handed everything that should have been hers. She had buried that feeling once, by burying the girl who caused it. It was climbing back up out of the ground. A few days on, they gave the flight a proper audience. Tia went up on Georges with Wilma Nielsen riding behind her, the same fearless soldier who had been first to trust a dragon under Amelia's method, and the great flame dragon lifted off clean and easy. It hung in place. It flew backward. The border knights stood in the grass with their mouths open. Amelia, who found a gaping crowd more tiresome than a monster, explained the mechanics to whoever stood nearest. Dragons floated on a levitation, magic worked inside the body, she said. The wings only steered and drove, like oars. For real speed, a dragon injected its own magic in a burst. It should not have worked. It worked anyway. When Georges sat down, Tia climbed off, flushed and laughing, crossed the grass straight to Amelia, and called her elder sister, out loud, in front of the soldiers, the knights, and half the town. Julian made a sound like a man missing a stare. Amelia only shrugged and said she did not mind the title. The two of them had gotten close over a great deal of plain girls talk, and if Tia wanted to call her that, she could. Off to the side, Julian and Cedric put their heads together, and their faces were not the faces of men watching a sweet moment. A fourth princess naming a commoner researcher her elder sister in public was not a whim. It was a shield thrown over Amelia in front of witnesses, a statement in the only language the court spoke that this woman stood under imperial favor and was not to be touched. And out past the training field, running up every road toward the capital, the rumor was already going that there was a dragon saint on the frontier who had healed a dying princess. Julian said, dryly, that the nobles would start arriving soon. He was right. The nobles were not the first to come for her. The church was. Amelia was walking out to the training grounds with the little telepathy dragon Sieg riding her shoulder, turning over something Theodore had said about building medical tools that could drain magic the way the flame dragon did, when an old man in white robes stepped into her path and named himself a bishop. He had come, he said, for the reincarnated dragon saint of legend. He laid her feats out like offerings, the dragons that obeyed her, the fire she had put out, the princess she had raised from a deathbed, and begged her to let him bring her into his church, where all that power could serve the suffering. Amelia said no. She said she had no interest in gods and did not believe in fate, and that if a god wanted her to do something, he could come down and bow to her himself. She turned to go. The bishop caught her by the arm and held on. She had already shifted her weight for a defensive kick when Julian arrived instead, stepping between them and lifting the old man's hand off her arm with a look. He asked coldly by what authority a churchman laid hands on a woman who had already refused him. He reminded the bishop that the empire had cut church from crown 80 years ago, that forcing service on anyone without cause was against the law, and that he would happily carry the matter to people who would enjoy it far less than he would. The bishop went pale and left quickly. Walking her the rest of the way, Julian explained the shape of it. The northern church here in the empire was losing ground to the southern church across the border, which had crowned its own saint, a princess of Elmenia, and was riding her fame for all it was worth. So the northern bishops were desperate for a saint of their own, and a living woman who truly commanded dragons was the answer to a prayer. Then he said, more plainly than he usually let himself, that he would keep her work safe from all of it. Amelia weighed him, decided he meant it, and let him. The next thing that came for her, Cedric got to first. He had noticed what she had not, that outsiders were pushing harder at the borders of Walkure lately, turned back each time by his soldiers, but pushing. What he told her first was her own name. As of that morning, he said, her full name was Amelia Harwood, a commoner, eldest daughter of a family in Aldbury that had never existed until his clerks invented it, papered and sealed and legally airtight. Amelia asked what it was for, and Cedric explained the thing that Elmenia had built and could not now unbuild. 7 years ago, the kingdom had declared her dead. It had to, in order to crown its saint on her supposed sacrifice. A girl who did not die out on the peninsula would have made a liar of the whole story. So on paper, they had killed her. Now the kingdom had learned she was alive and worth having, and had begun quietly reaching across the border to reclaim her through her old noble blood, to take their citizen back and the treasure she had turned into. They could not. That was the whole of it, and it was beautiful. A foreign crown could demand a noble of its own realm. It could demand nothing at all of a commoner born in another empire. To reclaim Amelia, Elmenia would first have to prove she was Amelia, would have to stand up in front of the world and say that the girl they had buried 7 years ago to make Carmilla holy was breathing after all. They would have to burn their own saint to reach her. She was safe precisely because they had thrown her away so completely. The lie they had told to be rid of her was now the wall she stood behind. The door they had bolted on her 7 years ago from the outside, they could not open again without the whole rotten house coming down on their heads. Cedric had not fought their move at all. He had simply let their own lie do the work and turned the worst thing that had ever been done to her into the one thing they could never take back. Amelia sat with that a moment. The family that had packed her into a windowless carriage to die could reach out now with both hands and close on empty air. It was not revenge. She had never gotten her revenge. But it was a door shut in their faces, bolted from her side this time, and for a woman who had spent 7 years half expecting the past to come back up the road for her, it was enough to make her go quiet. Then, because she was Amelia, she moved straight onto the coast. The ports could be built, she reported. The survey held. The wind-scoured shoreline carried almost none of the scent marks dragons fought over, so the coastal species tolerated change there in a way inland species never would. Build inland and the territorial dragons would level it to splinters. Build modest on the coast, and it would stand, though every port would need one permanent person who could talk a curious dragon out of wrecking the docks. And Cedric was no longer listening to the coast. He was looking at the bruised shadows under her eyes. He asked carefully when she had last slept. About 6 days ago, she thought. He came up out of his chair, but Amelia was still talking, still bright, still insisting she was fine, that her eyes were only clear because the research excited her. And then the floor came up, and the room went out like a snuffed lamp, and she never felt Cedric catch her. She woke 3 days and nights later to the sound of someone crying. Tia was at the bedside with both hands wrapped around Amelia's, weeping openly, saying through it how afraid she had been and how glad she was now, how she had truly thought her elder sister might die. Julian stood behind her, furious in the particular way of a man who has been badly frightened. He said he had told her to sleep. He said his heart had all but stopped when they carried her in, that this could not go on, that someone was going to have to take her days in hand before her own work killed her, because she plainly would not do it herself. Amelia, flattened and hollow-eyed and caught, could not find the argument. She had frightened them. That got through where nothing else had. When she could sit up, Cedric came, and he brought news that made even Amelia go still. The Empress Fiona would host a grand party. Its face would be a celebration of Tia's recovery, the fourth princess, walking and riding and flying, living proof that the dragons were safe. Its heart would be Amelia, presented before the whole empire as the center of everything the dragon program was going to be. The girl a kingdom had written off as dead was about to be stood up in a hall full of the highest people in the empire and named its future. Amelia's answer to being named the future of the empire was that she would rather not. She said she wanted nothing to do with a large formal event, that she was not made for a place like that, and she meant every word of it. The three of them wore her down in shifts. Cedric laid out the game. Presented as a guest of the Empress, she would be read by the whole court as backed by the first prince's faction, and that kind of standing was a wall around her research that no bishop and no foreign crown could climb. He would hire her assistants from the capital's academies too, he said, partly to spare her, partly, he did not quite say, to keep her from starving at her own desk again. Amelia asked hopefully whether Tia could just be her assistant instead. Tia smiled and said it was a tempting offer, but she had her own duties now, as a princess, with a small, astonished pleasure under the words, because having duties at all was new. Then it came out that the party was an international dance, that Amelia would have to wear a gown, that she would have to dance in it. She dropped into a flat-footed squat with her knees wide, the crouch of a woman used to bracing over a dragon in the mud, and Julian looked as though something in him had briefly died. "Goodbye," she said, standing. "I am leaving." She got 2 steps. Julian's hand closed on her shoulder like a vice and did not move. He was hollow-eyed and immovable and entirely done negotiating. He told her the party honored their eldest brother, Leon, the man who would one day be emperor, and that her being there mattered to every scrap of support dragon research would ever get, and that he was not going to let her run. And Amelia, held fast, looked at the thing from the other side for the first time. A hall full of the people whose world had decided, 7 years ago, that she was worth more dead than alive. They had thrown a nameless noble daughter to the peninsula. What was going to walk into that hall was Amelia Harwood, commoner of the empire, the woman the dragons answered to, on a name they could never take away. She stopped pulling against Julian's hand. She still, she said, was not going to enjoy the gown. None of it had come due yet. The crown still sat on the wrong head, across a border, on a girl who had earned nothing, and no one had answered for the carriage or the veil or the boat. But the door was bolted now from her side. A once dying girl was flying over the frontier and calling her sister in front of the world, and the whole empire was raising a stage with her name on it. The road the rumor was running led straight to the capital. Amelia was going to walk into it wearing a gown she hated, and she was going to walk in as herself. Julian had tried patience, logic, and Tia's violin, and none of it moved Amelia 1 inch toward the dance floor. Then he opened a small wooden box. Inside sat a dragon stone, a pale palm-sized mass that formed over years inside a living dragon from swallowed scraps of magic stone. Most researchers went a whole career without holding one. Amelia's boredom evaporated on the spot. She lunged. Julian closed the lid and stepped clear in a single motion. The stone was hers, he told her. The day she could cross a ballroom without disgracing the entire party. She took the deal before he finished the sentence. The steps came easier than she feared. Years in the field had left her balanced and quick, and Julian led cleanly enough that she barely had to think. When his stern face bent close to murmur a correction, playing the courtly gentleman as gravely as a man at a funeral. She lost it and laughed out loud. Tia kept the music going from the corner, delighted with both of them. It was on the second round that Amelia noticed Sieg, the little telepathy dragon, who spent most of his life asleep on somebody's shoulder, had lifted his head and fixed the pair of them with a bright, unblinking stare. He almost never bothered with anything. She danced the rest of the lesson with one eye on him, turning the oddity over, and filed it away unsolved. Passing the dance only bought her a new sentence. Conversation etiquette next. Amelia groaned like a woman handed a life term. The groan died when a sealed letter arrived from the capital, addressed to Tia in the Empress Consort's own hand. Tia opened it and her eyes filled. Fiona had written to congratulate her on her recovery, to say plainly that she looked forward to seeing her again, and to announce a gift, a riding outfit ordered to match the party dress already being made. Not long ago, Tia had believed her illness made her a burden nobody wanted. She read the letter twice, wiped her face, and did not try to hide it. Then the professionals arrived, a designer and a stylist summoned from the capital under imperial guard because the border had no one skilled enough. They laced Amelia into a corset. She had wrestled dragons. She had never met anything like it. She could not breathe, could not bend, and said so at length, while Tia and the two women debated cuts and colors over her head. Over several fittings, she stopped fighting the thing. She never once stopped hating it. Then she hauled out a wooden crate and set it in front of them. It was packed with the long white wool of a snow dragon, shorn from the cold highlands of the peninsula, smoother than silk and cool to the touch like autumn wind. She gave them the whole crate. When the designer stammered about payment, Amelia waved it away. All she wanted, she told them, was a detailed written report on exactly how the wool changed as they worked it and what it finally became. The two women stared at the crate as though she had handed them a kingdom. Julian laid out the rest of it before they left. They would not slip into Helzheim quietly. They would ride in, a full column of dragons straight down the capital's main avenue, in front of the whole city. The crowd was the point. People feared dragons, and the Empire needed them to stop. So Tia would ride at the very front, a beloved princess sitting calm and safe on a beast the size of a house, living proof that the creatures could be trusted. Fear turned to wonder faster that way than any decree could manage. Tia agreed at once, glad down to the bone to be needed for something. There was work first. 6 newly caught 6-winged dragons had to be gentled into mounts within the month, with Amelia's hands on every one of them. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he and Tia were enrolled at Arcadia Academy under a self-study arrangement, and that an anniversary party there fell before the royal one. Amelia caught the thing he did not say. He dreaded going back to the capital at all. Later, Tia told her why. Too many court women hunted her brother for his face and his blood, and years ago, one of them, a girl who had wanted to keep him for herself, had turned a quarrel vicious and left Tia shamed in front of the entire court. That girl, Tia said quietly, was Carmilla, the same Carmilla that Elmenia now paraded as its living saint. Amelia asked, in complete honesty, whether Julian was truly so handsome. Since she had spent so long among dragons, she had lost the knack of telling. Tia laughed until she had to sit down, and understood at last why her brother could breathe around this one woman and no other. Helzheim did not do anything by halves. The capital's main avenue ran straight as a spear from the outer gate to the palace, wide enough for a column of dragons, and the city guard had cleared it curb to curb. When the gates swung open, the sound hit them like weather. Tens of thousands of people packed the avenue and the windows and the rooftops above it, and every one of them was shouting. Tia rode at the very front, small and straight-backed on Georges, the great ember-scaled serpent pacing slow and gentle beneath her. She lifted one hand to the crowd, and the crowd came apart at the seams. A princess who had been dying a season ago now sat easy on a dragon the size of a barn, unafraid, and the fear went out of the people in one breathless roar and came back as something close to worship. Behind her, the column moved, 11 dragons, scaled and feathered and horned, pacing between 2 solid walls of human noise. Amelia rode near the middle on a 6-winged mount. Sieg flattened against her neck, and for once in her life, she had nothing dry to say. She let the noise wash over her, and did the arithmetic anyway, because she could never help it. 7 years ago, a girl had been sealed inside a windowless carriage, veiled so no one would learn her face, and rode out past the last buoy to die quietly quietly, on an island every map marked as death, so that a liar could be called holy. Nobody had cheered that girl. Nobody had been meant to remember she had ever existed. That same girl now rode down the grandest street of the empire her old kingdom feared most, and a foreign capital screamed its welcome until the cobbles shook under the dragon's feet. She did not weep. She was not built for it, but she sat a little straighter on the dragon's back, and she let herself, just this once, believe the noise was real. The cheering carried, in its way, not the sound of it, but the news. Word reached Elmenia within days, and it did not land kindly. It ran through the palace that the scapegoat, the girl the Reeves family had packed off to die on the peninsula so their princess could be crowned for surviving it, had not died at all. She was alive. Worse, she was useful, riding at the head of the enemy empire's dragons while a whole capital roared her name. Cain Reeves heard it and said nothing anyone cared to repeat. Carmilla heard it in her saint's robes and went very still. The lie had been buried with a corpse that refused to stay buried, and for the first time, the ground beneath it shifted. Nobody moved to set it right. Nobody yet could. The column filed off the avenue into the palace grounds, where a temporary stable had been raised near Nordret Palace to house the dragons. A man was waiting for them, and he was enormous. The first prince, Leon, stood nearly 7 feet of easy muscle, with cropped fair hair and a grin that arrived a step ahead of him. He swept Tia off the ground before she could curtsy, laughing, then hauled Julian up too by way of hello, ignoring his brother's wounded dignity entirely. Then he turned to Amelia. "So you are the dragon master those two will not stop writing to me about," he said, and there was nothing polished in it. She had dragged his brother out of the sea and given his little sister her life back. If she ever wanted anything the throne could reach, he told her, she had only to ask. He walked toward Georges as he said it. Amelia opened her mouth to warn him. The Ember Dragon trusted almost no stranger and weighed a person carefully before it let them near. Leon laid one broad hand flat against its scaled neck. Georgius studied him a moment, then rumbled low in its chest and leaned into the touch like an old dog by a fire. She shut her mouth again. She had spent years learning why dragons chose the people they chose, and this man had just skipped the entire process with a smile. Beside her, Julian watched his brother with open admiration. Amelia watched too, but differently. She had a fresh puzzle now, and she fully intended to take it apart. The Empress Consort received them the next morning, and she did not waste anyone's time pretending. Fiona was the late Emperor's widow, silver-tongued and a good deal colder than she looked, and she went straight to the point. She meant to use Amelia and her dragons for the Empire's politics, and she would rather say so than dress it up. Amelia told her she had worked that out already. Fiona seemed to like her the better for it. The terms were plain. The support would flow as long as the results did, and it could stop the day they dried up, and she was clear about that too. In return, Amelia named what she actually wanted. Not gold, not a title. A proper dragon research facility, sealed and sterile, with a storage vault built to hold specimens no one else in the world would even keep in a jar. Fiona approved it on the spot. There was a price. Amelia would stand up at Arcadia Academy in 5 days and give a public lecture, presented as the first dragon researcher the world had ever produced, a stage before the capital's finest to make the Empire's new marvel official. Amelia barely heard the politics in it. She was going to have a laboratory where she could study dragon droppings, freely and safely, for the rest of her natural life. As far as she was concerned, she had just robbed the woman blind. She wrote the lecture in a fever. Years of field notes poured out onto the page, and to her deep satisfaction, most of them were about dung. Julian found the manuscript 3 days later. He read 4 pages, went pale, and read them again to be certain. It ran past 50 pages, and it was very nearly cover to cover about dragon and animal droppings, what they revealed, how she gathered them, and everything the years of doing exactly that had taught her. He asked her, with the strained calm of a man clinging to the last of his patience, why every single subject she loved had to be filth. "You told me to take pride in my work and hold my head high," Amelia reminded him. He had said no such thing about dung, he told her through his teeth, and offered to correct the draft himself. The argument went on for a while. It was still going when the candles burned low. The lecture script survived barely into something respectable, and on the day itself, they rode out to Arcadia Academy, a walled complex so vast it rivaled the Imperial Palace. They did not get 3 steps inside before the swarm hit. Noble girls converged from every direction, drawn to the 2 princes and the new dragon master like ants to spilled honey. At their head swept Priscilla Ygritte, a glittering, curled, jeweled young woman with a smile like sugar poured over a knife. She and her circle pressed invitations on Tia and Julian. Come to our estate, honor our house, meet our family. The whole performance a barely veiled bid to bind a marriage to Julian while his standing was high. In the same breath, they took Amelia in with a cool, dismissive sweep and let their whispers do the rest. A shabby, plain nobody in a scholar's robe, drifting somewhere she plainly did not belong. Amelia, who had once stood alone against a maddened dragon, found a knot of hostile girls almost restful. She murmured that they swarmed like ants on a dropped sweet, earned a swat on the head from Julian, and a finger to the lips from Tia, and then simply raised her voice and reminded everyone, loudly, that the staff were waiting on them all for the lecture meeting. The girls scattered like startled birds. Into the quiet, Tia looped her arm firmly through Amelia's and called her, in front of every one of them, her big sister, the woman who had saved her from her illness and whom she loved without reservation. The watching girls stiffened. A favored commoner was one thing. A princess's openly claimed sister was quite another, and the sums rearranged themselves visibly on their faces. Julian let out a long breath and thanked Amelia for the rescue. She waved it off with something dry, and a little of the exhaustion went out of him as he almost smiled. Priscilla Ygritte watched the whole thing from the edge of the emptying hall, and she did not smile at all. The third prince found them in the corridor, and the morning went sour in a heartbeat. Amelia had just come out of the staff room, where the three of them had gone over the coming lecture one last time. On the way out, Julian had admitted, stiff as a man confessing a crime, that he had quietly arranged for her to sit down with the Academy's research professors and pick their brains for her dragon work. She had been genuinely pleased, she had said so. Then Jasper came around the corner with his cluster of hangers-on, and pleased was over. He was the sort of handsome that curdled the moment he opened his mouth. He looked Julian up and down, said something cutting about a second prince of commoner blood playing at importance, and then his gaze slid to Amelia. With a slow leer, he dismissed her as his brother's kept woman, dressed up in a scholar's coat to hide what she really was. Julian went rigid. He denied it so violently, and with such a flustered list of Amelia's actual habits, that the denial nearly did more damage than the insult. She went days unwashed in the field, he snapped. She handled dragon droppings with her bare hands. Whatever anyone imagined was happening, that was the opposite of it. Amelia, standing there being described as a walking hygiene problem, decided not to take offense. It was, after all, accurate. That was when the girl approached. She came from the side, small and hesitant in the white academy uniform, and told Jasper in a thin voice that the task he had set her was finished. Amelia had a half second to register that this was Claudia, the Duke's daughter Jasper was engaged to, before the prince rounded on her. All of his thwarted temper, the insult that had not landed, the brother who had not cowered, all of it poured down onto the one person in the corridor who could not fight back. He raised his hand. Amelia moved before she chose to. She caught Claudia by the arm and pulled her clear, one clean tug that took the girl out of reach and left Jasper's hand cutting empty air. Off balance, swinging at nothing, the prince stumbled and had to catch himself against the wall in front of his own followers. For a long, delicious moment, nobody knew where to look. Julian recovered first and tore into him. Turning on a defenseless girl was beneath contempt, he said, and he would report every word of it to the proper authorities. Jasper, scarlet, snarled something about his own word being law and stalked off with his people trailing behind. Claudia thanked Amelia in a whisper and slipped away before anyone could ask her a single question. Amelia watched her go, turning it over. A duke's daughter, flinching like a beaten dog, carrying herself smaller than any commoner. She knew that particular smallness from the inside. She filed the girl away and said nothing. The lecture hall was built like a concert theater, tiered seats climbing in a ring so that every eye fell on the stage below. Several hundred of them waited there, nobles and scholars both, murmuring, doubtful, arms folded. Amelia stepped up to the podium, which had a voice-carrying magic tool set into its face, and introduced herself under the name Harwood. She had never once felt stage fright, and she did not start now. She opened with a tidy little lie, a childhood tale of a sea dragon that had plucked her from a whirlpool, a story built to hide the truth of who she was, and where she had really met the dragons. Then, she got to work. She walked the hall through what a dragon actually ate, which was not people. She laid out how clever the creatures were, how much they were worth to a nation that stopped screaming long enough to study them, how the man-eating monster of every bedtime story was mostly a story. The folded arms began, slowly, to unfold. Near the end, as she moved to close, Jasper shot to his feet. His voice cracked across the hall. In substance, he branded her a traitor, a schemer bought to loose dangerous beasts on the Empire, and he warned the crowd not to be taken in by a smiling commoner. Somewhere in the front rows, Priscilla Ygritte sat very still, and the pale-faced girl beside Jasper, Claudia, tried in a small voice to talk him down. It did no good. The hall held its breath and waited to see the outsider crumble. Off to the side, Julian began to rise, ready to put himself between Amelia and the accusation. She caught his eye and, with the smallest movement of her hand, waved him back down. This one she wanted for herself. Being shielded would only prove she was something that needed shielding. She let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. Then she answered, and she did not raise her voice. "A pen kills a man if you put it through his eye," she said, pleasant as a tutor. "A chair kills him if you bring it down on his skull. A kitchen knife, a plow horse, a farm bull. Every household in this hall keeps a dozen things under its roof that would kill a careless owner by nightfall. We do not burn the kitchen down. We learn where the sharp end is." She let that settle. "Fear was never the safeguard," she went on. "Knowledge is. A dragon mishandled is a danger, exactly like the knife in your own cupboard is a danger. And the answer to both is the same. You study the thing until it stops being a mystery. That is the whole of my treason. I intend to teach this empire where the sharp end is." She bowed. For one heartbeat, the hall was utterly silent. Then it came apart into applause, a wall of it, rolling down the tiers and breaking over the stage, and Jasper stood in the middle of it with his charge in pieces at his feet. Amelia watched the room turn from the podium and read it the way she read a herd deciding to trust her. In the front row, Tia had her hands clasped under her chin, beaming, and the scholars around her were nodding to one another, as though a bet had just been settled in her favor. Gray-haired professors, who had come to judge a commoner, leaned forward instead, already wanting to ask her things. An old skeptic 2 rows up had folded his arms at the start of the hour and was now clapping harder than anyone. Even the wavering ones, the nobles who had walked in, convinced a princess-backed outsider was a threat to be managed, found themselves on their feet without quite deciding to stand. He had branded her a traitor in front of hundreds, and the hundreds were on their feet cheering the traitor. He sat down hard, and near him, Priscilla Ygritte had gone pale and small, and the frightened girl in the next seat was looking at Amelia with something that was not fear at all. Nobody was looking at Jasper anymore. Afterward, Julian and Tia would not stop praising her. Tia said she had looked like a speaker of 20 years standing, not a woman at her first public lecture, and Julian told her the scholars especially had been won over. Amelia took it the way she took all praise, which was to shrug it off and change the subject to the science. They warned her about Jasper, though. He was not really the danger, they explained. The danger was the faction behind him. His handlers kept him a pampered figurehead, deliberately starved of any real skill at governing, so that his ignorance would leave them free to guard their own privileges. His outburst at the lecture might have been his own temper, or it might have been staged for him. With a puppet, you could never quite tell where the strings ended. Over the next several days, Amelia came back to the academy again and again, trading knowledge with its scholars. She sat with a magic scholar and a botany scholar, and lost happy hours on ley lines, on the monavents that opened in the earth and leaked raw power, on the strangely young forest near the capital that had risen from such event barely 30 years past. She learned of a ground-dwelling dragon that grew a whole fruit tree on its back and could change the fruit it bore at will. She was, for once, entirely content, and every few days she caught the girl watching her. Claudia would be there at the edge of a corridor, at the far end of a hall, looking at Amelia with something unspoken pressing behind her eyes, and the instant Amelia looked back, she bolted like a startled hare. It was not hostile. It was a girl trying to work up the nerve to say a thing she was too frightened to say. Amelia had been that girl, in another life, in a hospital bed, and the recognition sat in her chest and would not leave. Then Julian ruined the peace by informing her that the academy wanted her at its founding anniversary party, which meant a gown and dancing, and standing in a hot room being pleasant to people she had no use for. Amelia asked whether the royal party she was already trapped into was not sacrifice enough. Julian said no. She tried to run. There was, briefly, an undignified chase through the halls and out into the garden, and Amelia proved a very fast runner, right up until Julian proved a faster one and marched her off to be measured for a dress. She went to her fitting the way a soldier goes to a bad posting, and told herself it was only one evening. They laced her into a rented blue gown embroidered with small pale flowers, drawn so tight at the waist that Amelia was fairly sure she could feel her own spine. Tia coached her through it with the patience of long practice, telling her to breathe out and let her stomach go flat inside the bodice instead of fighting the whole apparatus. Amelia, who had wrestled thrashing dragons the length of a barn, found herself defeated by a length of ribbon and a set of stays. She said as much. Tia only smiled and adjusted a pin. Julian met them at the door in a formal navy suit, and then the evening produced its first small disaster. He looked at Amelia, plainly meant to say something kind, and managed only that she looked like a perfectly ordinary young lady, which even he seemed to realize, halfway out of his mouth, was not the triumph of gallantry he had been reaching for. Amelia told him he cleaned up passably too, in the tone one uses for a horse that has been brushed. Between the two of them, Tia put a hand over her eyes and gave up on both of them entirely. The evening, Julian explained as they walked, was really a rehearsal. The Academy's founding party tonight was the small one. The grand one, the recovery anniversary party the royal family would host, fell some 20 days off, and this was the dress run for it. Get through tonight, he said, and the harder night would come easier. Amelia heard almost none of it. She was doing arithmetic on how quickly she could locate the food, eat, and leave. She had come to the party for exactly one reason, and the reason was research funding, and everything between here and the funding was an obstacle to be endured. She squared her shoulders inside the miserable corset and let herself be walked toward the noise. The ballroom blazed under a ceiling of hanging crystal, packed wall to wall with students and nobles, and Amelia had been inside it for perhaps 10 minutes when Priscilla Egret came for her. She swept up with a fan, raised to hide her sneer, and a knot of flatterers at her heels, and she made her contempt into a performance for them. She wanted to know, loudly, how a commoner dared stand so familiar with the princes. She mocked the borrowed gown. She sneered that no amount of dressing up gave a nobody the right to imagine herself royalty's friend. And when Amelia only looked at her, unbothered, the sneer widened, because silence read to Priscilla as a woman who had run out of answers. Amelia had not run out of answers. Amelia had simply been deciding which one to use. She had spent her adult life among things most of this room would faint to look at directly, and it occurred to her, standing there in a rented gown with her ribs in a vice, that she was carrying the perfect weapon, and these people had handed her the opening themselves. They found her knowledge beneath them. Fine, she would give them her knowledge. So she smiled, warm and helpful, and offered to explain something interesting. Since we are all standing here, she said pleasantly, let me tell you about the parasites. She kept her voice bright and unhurried, a tutor delighting in her subject. She told them about the worms that live inside the field animals, whose meat sat, that very evening, on the silver platters along the walls. She described cheerfully how the creatures made their home in a living gut, how they traveled, how they came into a person who ate carelessly and settled in to stay, invisible and patient, for years. She named how common it was. She lingered, gently, on the word living. She did not raise her voice once. She smiled the entire time. The color went out of the room in a slow, spreading wave. Priscilla's flatterers turned first, one shade of green after another, glancing at the platters, then away from the platters, then desperately toward the doors. A jeweled young lord pressed a gloved hand to his mouth. Priscilla herself, who had sailed in ready to reduce a commoner to tears, went chalk white behind her fan and could not find a single word to fire back, because there was no answering a woman who was only, helpfully, telling you the truth. Her circle broke and scattered for the fresh air. The great triumphant snob of Arcadia fled her own ambush, and she was not the only scene the wave took. A few paces off, Jasper had been mid-humiliation of his own. He had cornered Claudia over her plain, unflattering gown, loudly, cruelly, informing her that the fiancé of a future emperor had disgraced him by dressing like a servant, threatening in front of everyone to end the engagement, every ugly word of it purely for show. Claudia had stood there absorbing it, murmuring that he himself had told her to wear the dress, shrinking smaller with each sentence. Then Amelia's lecture rolled over that corner of the room too, and Jasper's grand performance of contempt collapsed mid-sentence as the prince went the same shade as everyone else and had to clutch his own stomach and withdraw. His threat, his authority, his cruelty, all of it drowned under a tide of nausea he could do nothing about. Nobody was frightened of him. Everyone was frightened of the platters. Half the ballroom emptied toward the doors and the balconies. Silk skirts caught on chair legs in the scramble. A dowager fanned a swaying daughter toward the cold air. Somewhere, a dropped glass rang out, and nobody turned to look, because turning to look meant facing the platters again. The string players near the far wall trailed off note by note and simply stopped, bows lifted, watching the room dissolve around them. Amelia stood alone and unhurried in the middle of the chaos she had made, a commoner in a rented gown who had walked into a room built to shame her and routed it without raising her voice or lifting a hand. The verdict these people lived by, that she was a worthless nobody with no right to the air she breathed, lay in ruins on the ballroom floor, and every witness in the hall had watched it shatter. Not one of them would remember this night as the evening a commoner was put in her place. They would remember it as the night she cleared a ballroom with a smile and a lecture on worms, and they would tell it that way for years. Julian appeared at her elbow, torn clean down the middle between mortification and a pride he could not quite hide, and begged her, faintly, to please stop. Amelia looked at the wreckage of the party, the fleeing snob, the green-faced prince, and allowed herself, privately, to enjoy it very much. A kingdom away, in Elmenia, the news arrived by a different road, and it landed badly. Word had been trickling in for weeks now, each report worse than the last. The scapegoat lived. Not only lived, but rode at the head of the enemy empire's dragons, lectured its scholars, was cheered in its capital, and was now, if the latest letters were true, the talk of its academy. Carmilla, who had been crowned a living saint for surviving a peninsula she had never set foot on, sat with the pages in her lap and did not move for a long time. She said nothing anyone would care to repeat. The lie she had been dressed in for 7 years was straining at every seam, and she could feel it. Cain Reeves, head of the family that had loaded a girl into a windowless carriage and sold her for a princess's crown, took the news in a colder silence still. The daughter they had thrown away as worthless was the most valuable person on the far shore of the sea, and there was nothing, legally or otherwise, he could reach. She was untouchable now, wrapped in a foreign empire's protection under a foreign name. He could only sit in his fine dark study and listen to the ground shift under a fraud he had built his family on. Neither of them acted. Neither of them could. But for the first time, the crown that sat on the wrong head had begun, very quietly, to crack. By the time the hall began to empty for good, the thing had already started turning into a story. They would write it down, later, exactly as it happened. The night entered the Academy's record as the Arcadian Academy incident. The evening a supposed commoner scholar had answered a noble's insult with a lecture on worms and cleared half a ballroom without touching anyone. It would be told and retold. And the woman at the center of it, the girl a whole kingdom had once decided was worth more dead than alive, would in time be honored across the empire by a title that outlived every person who had thrown her away. They would call her the mother of dragon research. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew her ribs hurt and she wanted to go home. Near the balcony, half in shadow, the frightened girl was watching her again. Claudia stood at the edge of the quiet, in her plain gown, looking at Amelia with that same unspoken thing pressing behind her eyes, larger now, closer to the surface than it had ever been. Twice tonight the girl had been trapped, once by a raised hand in a corridor, and once by a cruel man in a crowded room. And twice Amelia had, without meaning to, pulled the ground out from under the people cornering her. Claudia had noticed. Whatever she was carrying, whatever secret kept her flinching and watching and running, she had begun, at last, to look at Amelia the way a drowning person looks at a rope. Amelia met her eyes across the emptying hall, and, this time, did not let her bolt. She only held the look, steady, the way you hold still for a wary animal deciding whether to come closer. Claudia did not close the distance, not yet, but she did not run either, and that was new. There was a whole story behind that girl. Amelia was certain of it now, and it had claws in it. She could feel the shape of it the way she felt weather coming. Whatever it was, she thought, watching the Duke's daughter finally, slowly, hold her gaze. She was not going to walk past this one. She had walked past no one lately. That was rather the point. The morning after half a ballroom fled the platters, Julian pinched Amelia's cheek and told her at length exactly how badly she had disgraced the court. She defended herself. She had followed his one rule, nothing filthy, to the letter, and parasites were educational. Tia, summoned as a witness for the defense, went a little pale, set her tea down, and admitted in a small voice that the lecture had turned her own stomach too. Amelia looked at her sister, betrayed, and let the argument die. Then Julian let slip the more interesting thing. At the party, the third prince had tried to break his engagement to Claudia, and the parasite chaos had swallowed the attempt whole before anyone noticed. The Duke's daughter, it turned out, had started life as a commoner, a girl with a rare head for administration, bought up into a ducal line and pledged to the third prince. Why she stayed bound to a man who plainly despised her, no one at the table could say. The first prince arrived on the tail of that. Leon waved the whole scandal off as the noble's own fault for lingering to be sick, and then he set a far better problem in front of her. There was a thing in the Einbach forest, he said, something that laid down freezing fog in the dead middle of summer, rhymed the trees white, and had sent a whole guard unit home frostbitten. The locals called it the Einbach monster. He wanted her to find out what it was. He got about that far before she was leaning across the desk. "If it is a dragon," Amelia said, "you tell me first, always." Leon laughed and did not say no. And just like that, the scolding was forgotten, buried whole under the only word that could ever make her forget she was being scolded. The reports told a clear story to anyone who bothered to read them the way Amelia did. The frost had crept over the forest since early spring, thickening the damp air into pockets of fog cold enough to kill. Weather scholars had found no cause. Magic scholars, no unusual mana. But the frozen carcasses shared one thing. Every last one had been a predator. Boars, bears, big cats, snakes. The hunting and the aggressive. Never a deer. Never anything that grazed. Nothing had been eaten. They had simply been frozen where they stood and left. That was not a rampage. That was self-defense. Something in the forest was striking only what came at it teeth first, the way a dragon answers a threat and then walks away from the mess. Amelia told Leon a dragon was behind it, most likely one that could bend heat and cold around its own body. And she took the survey. She rode out the next morning with Wilma Nielsen, the two of them on plume-winged running dragons. The small lightning dragon, Zeke, curled on her shoulder as a weapon she hoped not to need. The forest ate the light. Even her sensing magic went blind. Too much raw mana soaked into the ground, the same way it had drowned her senses for years on the peninsula. Hours in, she found the footprint. She brushed it clean, laid her ruler across it, and ran the arithmetic the academy taught for weight and size. The number came back wrong small. Wings and tail set aside, the beast laying waste to predators across a whole forest was no bigger than a lion. Then Wilma crouched over something a few paces off and called her across. Human shoe prints. Clean ones, deliberate ones, pressed into ground where no one had any business setting a foot. A stretch with no trail, no reason, no sane way in for a person walking. Someone had stood exactly here. Amelia hunched a long moment over the neat little print and felt the whole shape of the thing shift under her hands. She had come to hunt a monster. She was now, she understood, also hunting a person. Deeper in, the creature signed itself again. Three-toed prints with claw marks bitten deep. A trail that ran flat and then simply stopped, as if whatever made it had gathered its legs and thrown itself into the sky. She pressed careful tracings and carried them back to a monster scholar at the academy, who turned them over, confessed that in all his years he had never seen the like, and named the likeliest owner. A wyvern-type dragon, built to walk the ground and take the air, both. A cold one, a small one, wandering a summer forest that should have driven any ice-blooded thing up into the mountains months ago. Crossing the campus at lunch, the tracings still in her bag, Amelia walked straight into a scene she knew from the inside. Priscilla Ygritte had the timid Duke's daughter backed against a flower bed, her circle of friends fanned out behind her, and she was flaying the smaller girl with words for the crime of standing where she could be seen. Priscilla noticed Amelia and forgot Claudia at once. Here was the commoner who had turned an entire ballroom green, the real author of her humiliation. She rounded on her, spat that a nobody had no business rising the way she had, and swung an open hand to slap the insolence off her face. Amelia swayed back. The hand went past her cheek. Priscilla swung again, and Amelia leaned the other way, unhurried, the way a person steps around a puddle, and the second slap found nothing but warm summer air. By the time the third swing missed, the noble was breathing hard and losing her audience. Amelia let her tire herself all the way out. Then she tilted her head and asked, pleasant as a tutor with a favorite subject, whether the lady would care to hear about parasites. Priscilla went white to the lips. Her friends were already backing away. Within moments, the whole glittering flock had bolted from the courtyard, and the snob who policed who was allowed to breathe near royalty had been routed a second time by a single word. That left Claudia. Amelia turned to go, the tracings and the forest, and the small cold dragon all waiting on her. And the girl thanked her in a shaking whisper and promptly burst into tears. Amelia stood there and suffered it. She had never once known what to do with a crying person, and she genuinely had somewhere to be. But her feet would not carry her off, and she knew exactly why. She had been this girl, small, cornered, pathetically grateful for scraps of kindness, folded in on herself because the world had told her she counted for less, eating her lunch alone in a library, in a life she worked hard not to think about. She had lived inside that exact smallness once, so she stayed. The whole of it came out between the sobs. Claudia had been born common. Her father drank and gambled and drowned the household in debt, and a ducal house bought that debt up and named its price, which was the daughter. She had been adopted, remade into a lady, scrubbed of the girl she used to be, and pledged to the third prince, who looked down on born commoners and never let her forget which one she was. The old nobles sneered at her for climbing. The commoners she came from resented her for the same thing. She belonged nowhere at all, and she was promised for life to a man who could not stand the sight of her. And still, she stayed inside it, Amelia noticed. The way a person stays who has told herself she owes it because someone raised her, because walking out feels like a theft even when the thing being stolen is her own life. Amelia knew that reasoning too. It was the kind that kept a girl in a carriage. Amelia did not do false comfort, so she told her the plain thing. If you hate it this much, she said, then leave it. Then, because it was honest, that she had no money to make leaving easy, since every coin she earned went straight into her research. Claudia looked up at her, wet-faced. No one's ever listened before, she said. Then she thanked her once more and hurried off across the gravel. And as she went, something worked loose from her shoe and dropped onto the path. Amelia stooped and picked it up. An acorn cup, the little woody cap that holds an oak nut. She turned it over in her fingers, looked slowly around the courtyard, and felt her attention go cold and sharp all at once. The grounds were planted with flowers and pruned ornamental trees, and not one single oak. They had pulled the messy things out years ago. Nothing here could have dropped this. And the girl's city loafers, she remembered now, had been caked to the sole with dried mud. The timid creature everyone in this school walked past had been somewhere wild, somewhere muddy, somewhere thick with oaks. Amelia pocketed the acorn cup and went looking for a plant studies professor. 4 days in the forest, and they had traces of the creature everywhere, and the creature itself nowhere. Wilma made her stop and drink, because Amelia forgot to when she was working, and would keep forgetting until she dropped. She drank, and let her worn-out mind wander, and it wandered somewhere useful. This forest never changed its weather. Back on the peninsula, the climate held fixed by region instead of by season, and that only happened where something powerful sat holding it in place. Something was holding these trees cold on purpose. She went back to the very first clue, that clean human shoe print, and this time she read it properly. It was small. It was flat. It had no grip at all. A cheap city shoe, the kind everyone wore in the capital, and no one who had ever set boot in real wilderness would drag into a forest full of things that froze predators solid. An outsider had walked these paths, an inexperienced one, a city one. She and Wilma rode the running dragons out to an artificial trail the herb gatherers used, and there stood an oak, heavy with acorns already scattered on the ground, its whole season thrown out of order by the forest's thick magic. And there, in the mud at its roots, Amelia found what she had been circling toward for 4 days. Fresh creature tracks and small city shoe prints, pressed down together over crushed acorn sprouts. The last rain had fallen a full 7 days back. These were new. The dragon and the city-shod stranger had walked this ground side by side within the week. The acorn cup was in her pocket. The muddy loafers were in her memory. She thought of a weeping girl in an oakless courtyard, and the two halves of her week reached across the days and took hold of each other, and she did not like the shape they made. Before she could chase the thought down, the forest filled with the drum of many riders. Julian came up the trail at the head of a mounted column, his cavalry on 6-legged feather dragons that could tear over roots and broken ground where a horse would snap its legs. He was dressed for hard riding, and he was not calm underneath it, whatever he made his voice do. The news came out of him fast and flat. The third prince had taken Claudia and a handful of other students into the Einbach forest. No permission, no proper escort. He meant to hunt the monster and kill it himself for the trophy and the glory of the thing, and they were somewhere in these trees at this very moment. Julian had scrambled every rider he could put on a dragon to reach them before the forest did. Amelia went very still. City shoes, an acorn cup, a timid girl who had been walking deadly paths no one else would touch, who kept coming back to the academy muddy and would not say a word about why. The out-of-place stranger she had hunted for 4 days and the sobbing girl she could not make herself walk past were one and the same person, and that person was loose now in the forest that froze predators where they stood, dragged in by a preening coward chasing a prize he could not handle. There was a particular kind of fool who mistook a monster hunt for a portrait he could pose inside, and Jasper was exactly that kind. He had brought a girl he despised into the deadliest ground in the Empire to make himself look brave, and he had brought her because she was his to bring and would not refuse him. Whatever else Amelia had failed to solve about the Einbach forest, She understood that much in a heartbeat, and it turned her cold clean through. She swung Sigurd around toward the deep woods before Julian had finished. "She's in here," Amelia said. "The girl. She's been in here before." She did not stay to explain it. The column poured off the trail behind her, dragons flooding into the frozen dark, and in the space of a breath, the hunt for a monster became a race to reach a girl before the monster's forest did. The frozen fog swallowed the column the moment it left the trail. It came up off the ground in white sheets, cold enough to burn, and it turned the running dragons into gray shapes, blowing past frost-cracked trees. Amelia leaned low over Sigurd and let him choose the ground. She could not sense a thing out here. The forest's thick mana drowned her the way deep water drowns sound, and for the first time in the whole hunt, that did not frighten her. It meant the thing laying this fog was close. Then something white cut across their path. It was not the fog. It moved against the fog, low and fast between the trunks, pale as bone and trailing cold mist off two swept-back horns. A lean, winged shape, about the size of a lion, built like a bird that had never quite decided to stop being a lizard. It did not attack. It ran a few strides ahead, looked back at them over one wing, and ran again. And Amelia understood in a single breath that it was not fleeing. It was leading. "Follow it," she called. Julian was already turning his mount to match her. The white dragon brought them through a stand of iced pines into a clearing, and the clearing was chaos. A monster stood at the center of it, a bear thing twice the height of a man, shaggy and heaving, its eyes gone a furious red, and it had something small cornered against the roots of a fallen tree. Scattered across the snow were the leavings of a hunting party in flight, a dropped satchel, a jeweled sword flung down and forgotten, tracks bolting away in every direction but toward the danger. Amelia caught one glimpse of the hunters themselves through the trees, fine coats crashing off through the underbrush, the third prince at the head of them, running from the very thing he had ridden out to kill. His orders carried back over his shoulder for no one who stopped to obey them. He did not look back at the girl he had left in the snow, not once. She stopped looking at him. He was not worth the turn of her head. "Drive it off," she said, and Julian gave the word, and the dragons moved. She did not draw it out. The running dragons hit the clearing from two sides at once, Wilma's mount and Sigurd fanning wide, and the white dragon came in low with a breath of freezing fog that whited out the beast's footing. One hard flying kick landed square and folded it sideways. That was enough. The bear thing did not stay to learn what came after. It broke and crashed away into the trees, and it did not come back. In the sudden quiet, the small cornered shape uncurled from the roots. A girl, mud to the knees, one ankle turned wrong beneath her, and threw both arms around the white dragon's neck as it folded down over her like a wing. She pressed her face into the pale scales and said a name into them. Lo, the way you say a name you have kept secret for years. Frost. Amelia swung down off Sigurd before he had stopped. She had spent 4 days tracking a monster through this forest, and now she stood in the settling fog and looked at a shivering girl with her arms locked around it, and every clue came home at once. The too small footprint, the city shoe where no city shoe belonged, the girl nobody ever bothered to listen to. She had not found the Ainbach monster. She had found the person who loved it. Wilma got an arm under the girl and eased the weight off the bad ankle. Amelia crouched to her level in the snow. "You're the keeper," she said. It was not a question. Claudia looked up at her, wet-faced and terrified, and still not letting go of the dragon, and did not deny a word of it. The story Amelia pulled out of her, some of it there in the snow, most of it later, in front of the throne, went back years to a girl who had nothing. Claudia had grown up in the poorest district of the capital, in a house that was mostly shouting. Her parents fought until her mother finally walked out for good, leaving an apology behind and nothing else, and her father drank and gambled away the rest of himself. So the girl taught herself. She kept the books at a magic tool shop because she could read and add, and she saved every coin toward the day she might be free of the place. When the saving went too slowly, she did the desperate thing that poor children do. She walked into Ainbach Forest alone to gather the costly medicine herbs that grew only where it was too dangerous to pick them. The forest nearly killed her. Monsters ran her down and cornered her against the roots, the same way they would corner her years later, and she shut her eyes and waited for the end. The end did not come. A white dragon came instead. It froze the thing solid where it stood, glanced at her once with pale, cold eyes, and flew off, and left her standing there alive and shaking and thinking one useless, dazzled thought, that it was beautiful. She should have run and never gone back. Everyone knew dragons ate people. She went back anyway. She read everything the library had, bought a monster repellent pouch with money she could not spare, and walked into the deadly forest a second time to find the thing that had saved her. She brought it meat to say thank you. It ignored the meat. Fish, fruit, vegetables. It wanted none of it, and a less stubborn girl would have given up. But Claudia only wrote it down. Over 2 secret years, she filled a notebook, that it drank water, that it ran as easily as it flew, that it breathed its freezing fog only in the hot months. She learned the whole of it without ever once managing to feed it. And slowly, the beautiful, terrible thing began to wait for her, to come when it felt her coming, to nose at her hands and chase a thrown stick like an enormous dog. She named it Frost, and she began to dream a small, impossible dream, that one day she would save enough to slip away to the Dragon Peninsula, the far country where dragons were said to live free, and take Frost with her, and belong somewhere at last. That was the dream. Then the world did to her exactly what it had once done to another girl, in a windowless carriage on the other side of the sea. A ducal house bought her father's debt, not out of mercy. Claudia was a distant relative they had a use for, and a bought debt is only a leash you have not felt tighten yet. They adopted her, scrubbed the slum off her, and drilled her into the shape of a noble lady, and once she was presentable, they pledged her to the third Prince Jasper as his bride. She had no say in any of it. Her savings were seized toward the debt. The forest visits all but ended, and Jasper wore the match like an insult he had been forced into, and took the insult out on her, belittling her low birth in front of anyone who cared to watch, wanting a decorative wife he could look down on, and nothing more. When she so much as thought of refusing, the household reminded her, coldly, that her drunk father and the kind old shopkeeper who had once raised her wages both lived within easy reach of people who did favors for dukes. So she stopped thinking of refusing. That was the girl, bought, caged, and pledged against her will by the very people who were meant to have saved her. Amelia would recognize it the instant she heard it, because it was, almost line for line, her own life read back to her. There had been exactly one flicker of light in it. Months before, a dragon researcher had come to lecture at the academy, a woman who had spent 7 years on the Dragon Peninsula and come home speaking about dragons the way Claudia had only ever dared to in her notebook. Claudia had slipped into that hall and left it dazzled, and had not gone within 10 steps of the woman afterward, because the researcher belonged to the First Prince's reformist faction, and Claudia belonged, body and debt, to the camp that hated it. She carried the dream a little further and told no one. Then Jasper announced he would hunt down and kill the Einbach monster to win his sinking popularity back. And Claudia understood, sick to her stomach, that the monster he meant to mount on a wall was Frost. So she volunteered for the hunt she dreaded, to steer the hunters wrong, to keep them off her dragon, and walked into the frozen forest to shield the one living thing that had ever chosen her, the Einbach monster. The beast that had frostbitten a guard unit and terrified a whole province had never been a monster at all. It was a lonely girl's only friend. They found Jasper's whole scattered party alive in the end. Bruised, humiliated, nothing worse. And then Amelia did the thing no one in the palace was braced for. She walked the feared Einbach monster straight in through the great doors. She brought Claudia up the length of the throne hall with the white dragon padding at her side, and she set the truth down in front of the Empress Fiona, the first Prince Leon, and Princess Tia, plainly. The beast that had frozen a guard unit and emptied a forest was this, a girl's dragon, named Frost, nothing more. Then, being herself, she nearly wrecked the whole rescue by trying to interview the evidence. She rounded on the terrified Claudia in the middle of the audience and started firing off questions. How did it feed? Did it truly refuse meat? How far could it throw its fog? Talking clean over Julian's attempts to slow her down, until he gave up on manners entirely, clapped a hand flat over her mouth, and hauled her bodily back a step so the Empress could actually hear the girl speak. And Claudia spoke, shaking, certain to her bones that the royals meant to punish her for hiding a monster. She told them what she had told no one alive, the rescue in the forest years ago, the notebook of records still sitting in her dormitory, the 2 years, the name. Amelia, muffled and gleeful behind Julian's glove, had already named the breed on sight, a winged ice dragon, pale and horned, that cooled itself by breathing frost, and so could live in warm country where no cold drake had any business surviving. Frost pressed against Claudia's knees the whole while, and would not be moved from them. Then the court turned, as courts always do, to the money. The Empress laid out the law without a scrap of warmth. The debt was real, the adoption legal, the engagement binding, all of it done properly, and none of it kind. Under the statutes, a debtor could be bound to labor or to marriage until the debt was cleared, and the law on forced marriage was written vaguely enough to drive a carriage through. That was Amelia's opening, and she took it on her feet. Then let me clear it, she said. The hall went quiet. Pay off her debts. All of them. Every coin. Through my faction. Take the repayment out of her wages afterward. I don't care how long it runs. And give her to me as my research assistant. She held the Empress's eye, then let her gaze drift deliberately to nothing in the room that wore a crown, and void the engagement to the third prince. This girl has spent more years watching real dragons than any scholar you keep. She is wasted as a decoration for a man who runs from the dark and leaves her in it. Let her come and do the work she was born for. It was not how a person addressed a throne. It was also, the whole room slowly understood, a very good deal. Fiona weighed it behind a still face. A bonded dragon keeper pried loose from Jasper's faction and folded quietly into her own, at the price of a debt her side could swallow without a blink, and found the arithmetic entirely to her taste. Leon allowed that the idea had real merit. Tia, warm and immediate, said the plain thing outright, that it made no sense on this earth to leave a girl who loved a dragon like that married off to a man like Jasper. They agreed to it, and then, because Fiona was far cleverer than she was kind, she set the last word down where it would look best, with Claudia herself. For a moment, the girl seemed unable to believe the question was real. She looked at the royals, and at Amelia, and down at the dragon, leaning its whole cold weight against her legs, and something in her face broke open. I want to be free of it, Claudia said, through tears, barely above a whisper, and yet perfectly clear in the huge cold hall. The engagement, all of it. I want to stay with Frost. I want to study dragons. She pressed a hand flat to the pale scales. That is all I have ever wanted. It was granted. The girl who had once been loaded into a carriage to die stood in the seat of imperial power and used it, not to burn a single soul, but to cut one frightened stranger loose from the exact trap that had once been built around her. Far away, in the kingdom that had thrown her out, the ground had started very slightly to move. For 7 years, Elmenia had told one story, that their gentle Princess Carmilla had been sent to the Dragon Peninsula, had survived where survival was impossible, and had come home a living saint. The church had blessed it, the court had crowned it, and on the strength of that lie, the Reeves family, the family that had folded their own daughter into a windowless carriage to play the corpse the story needed, had risen higher than they had any right to. Now, across the sea, an empire was chanting a different story. A dragon researcher, 7 years on the peninsula, a woman who did not merely survive the dragons, but commanded them, whom crowds in the imperial capital had taken to calling a saint in her own name. Tales travel the way tales do, merchant to merchant, port to port, and somewhere in the retelling people in Elmenia began, very quietly, to count on their fingers. 7 years, the peninsula, a saint, and to wonder, in the low voice you keep for dangerous questions, how a single exile could possibly have produced two. Carmilla felt it first, the way a liar always feels the floor before it goes, brittle and sleepless, clutching a halo that had begun to sit on her like a noose. Cain heard the murmurs reach his own ministry and could not trace them back to a single mouth he was permitted to shut. And Tanya, who had never once in 7 years allowed herself to wonder what became of the girl she sold, found the thought waiting for her now in every quiet room, that the daughter was not, after all, safely dead. Nothing fell, not yet. But for the first time since they sealed that door, the people who had sold her felt the cold draft of it swinging back open. It was only a tremor. Somewhere far beneath it, the real weight had begun to lean. Back in the Empire, with the papers signed and Claudia sworn to her, and Frost dozing in a heap of pale coils at their feet, Amelia was, for once, purely happy. She had spent 7 years as the only person alive who thought about dragons the way she did. Now she had a partner who kept a notebook. She said as much, plainly delighted, waving off the politics and the thanks alike. She was simply glad not to be working alone anymore. Claudia promised, earnest and nervous, to work hard. Julian, who never missed the nervous ones, told the new assistant quietly that he would help her find her feet. Then he set a hand on Amelia's shoulder and told her, without ceremony, that she had done well. He meant more than the rescue, and she knew he did, and for once, she let it stand, because here was the thing she had turned over the whole ride home. For years, her plan had worn a single shape: survive, grow strong, and one day make the family and the kingdom that discarded her answer for it. She had carried that across the sea like a stone in her chest, and she had just been handed the peak of her power, an empress in her debt, a legend in her name, dragons that came at her word. And she had spent it not on Elmenia, not on revenge, but on a frightened stranger she could have walked straight past. She had unmade what was done to her by refusing to let it be done again to Claudia. That, she understood now, was the truer answer. She would rather be seen and keep the family she had chosen than burn a house down to prove a point to people who had already decided she was worthless. The debt would come due on its own weight. She meant to be building something when it did, but she had not carried Frost into the palace only to win an argument about one girl. She set a heavier matter down before the throne. The magic vents, she reported, were multiplying, and no longer only on the peninsula. New ones were tearing open beyond it, past every border the dragons had kept for as long as anyone had kept records. Where they opened, the land went wrong. Plants ran riot. Monsters bred fast in the overgrowth, and the dragons, who lived by drawing raw magic out of the air, were beginning to follow the new feeding grounds outward. For the first time in living memory, dragons were being sighted off the peninsula entirely. If it kept on, she warned, the balance that had held the whole region steady for centuries could tip, and tip hard, toward collapse. Leon leaned forward at that. He had been watching the same shadow from his own side of it, the matching climb and monster attacks across the outer territories, and he put a blunt name to the whole of it. The dragons were spreading. The Empress heard them both out, and gave the honest, unhelpful answer of every ruler with a treasury to guard, that men and money could not be conjured out of nothing without a precedent to point to. So Leon made one. A lord in a territory called Oswell, near enough to reach quickly, had just sent word of a strange anomaly on his land, along with a plea for help. Let Amelia go and look into it, he offered. A favor to the Lord, a test case for the crown, and the first thread of the larger work, all in one. Amelia had taken it out of his hand before he finished the sentence. A new place, a new puzzle, an assistant at her side, and dragons in the sky. She was already gone in her head, half whooping like a girl let out of school early. Julian let out the sigh of a man who could already see the paperwork coming. Claudia stood a little straighter under the weight of the room and the enormous promise of the work ahead. The girl they had thrown to the dragons had a family now, chosen and not born, a country that called her its own, and the next horizon already fixed in her sights. And across the sea, the tremor kept spreading. The story of the Empire's dragon commanding saint would not stop traveling, and every league it covered pressed harder on the lie it so plainly resembled. Carmilla's sainthood, propped up for 7 years by a church that had staked its own name on it, began to buckle under the simple weight of a better saint who happened to be real. The whispers that one exile could not have made 2 survivors grew louder and harder to hush, and closer to the throne. And the family that had sold their daughter to build their standing found that standing turning to sand beneath them. The mother felt it worst. Tanya, who had bolted the carriage door with her own hand and never once let it cost her a night's sleep, was the first of them the reckoning came reaching for. Cornered now, watched now, her cold procedural power failing her by inches as the questions climbed toward her name. It would take longer to fall than a story likes. The church would fight for its saint, the family would fight for its lies, and the full collapse, the crown stripped, the mother brought at last to account, was still gathering out past the far edge of this tale. But it was coming. For 7 years the debt had stood upright and untouched, a lie the whole world had agreed to believe. Now it had begun, slowly, and then not so slowly, to lean. The girl they threw away had never lifted a finger against it. She had only refused to stay dead, and lived loudly enough that the truth could not be buried under her. And somewhere out past Oswell, and the spreading dragons, and the storm gathering over a kingdom that thought it had gotten away clean, the whole rotten weight of it was tipping, at last, toward the fall.